album trilogies 2020. And I know that you're probably thinking, okay, if they weren't released around the same time, then surely they share a similar sound palette. George Martin helped with a few songs in McCartney 3, and Linda provided backing vocals in McCartney 1, but for the most part, Paul McCartney is the only mastermind in this entire project, and I think that's amazing. It's an incredible feat that only shows that he's a genius, not only when it comes to songwriting, but also producing and performing. And since recently I put myself through the suffering of listening to John Lennon's unfinished trilogy with Yoko Ono, I said, why not make a video about a trilogy that I like a lot more, and that is exactly what we're going to do today.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
4 times.
Now I have to be honest, even though McCartney 1 is one of my favorite albums of all time, I'm pretty sure that your first listen of the album is not going to be that positive, especially if you just came out of the Beatles discography and are hoping for a similar level of quality in the production and in the recording and the overall songwriting of the record. I mean, half of the songs here are instrumentals. I remember the first time I heard this album, I was 15, maybe 16. I was living in South America, so I didn't have Apple Music or Spotify. I didn't have the money to buy the vinyl, so I had to search for the songs on YouTube and make a playlist in the order of the album. That's how I heard music back then. And the first time I listened to the record, I thought I had the wrong version of the album. I thought I was listening to the demos. I thought I was listening to the instrumentals because I couldn't believe that Paul McCartney, you know, one of the greatest songwriters of all time, one of the leaders of the Beatles, had put out such an unfinished album as his debut. Especially when you consider the fact that John Lennon that same year released Plastic Ono Band and George Harrison had released All Things Must Pass, two of the greatest albums in the history of music. So what is this album? And it's not only that half of the songs here are instrumentals, it's also the fact that this album is so poorly produced. I mean, listening to this album for the first time feels something like this. I swear to God that you can hear every single breath out of McCartney's mouth. The drumming is so dry, percussion seems to not even be there, you know, it's like, it's a really poorly produced album. I was so disappointed when I heard the album for the first time, but it's Paul McCartney, so I still gave it a couple more tries, and I realized the more I listen to the album, the more I like it, the more warmth and comfort I get from the record, and I understood why people liked it so much. This album feels very personal, you know, it feels like you're with McCartney in the studio, creating or figuring out your own sound. And I also realized how unfair comparisons to All Things Must Pass and Plastic Ono Band were, because John and George were already putting out solo stuff even when they were with the Beatles, so they had an opportunity to figure out their sound before they put out their actual debut as solo artists. Paul McCartney didn't have that opportunity. That's what's happening in this album. Paul McCartney is trying to figure out what he wants from music, and in my opinion, that feeling of intimacy paired with uncertainty is what makes this album such a magical experience. And if anyone wants to come here and tell me that this album is not even finished, it's rubbish, it's very poorly produced, I definitely agree with you, but I still believe this is one of his best albums because it's the feeling of being there with him, writing these songs, performing these tracks, producing the album that makes me enjoy it so much. Whenever I just want to listen to an album while I'm cooking something, on my way to work, maybe just because I want to read and I want something to play in the background, this is my go-to album. It's definitely one of the albums I've heard the most in my entire life because it gives me the feeling of comfort and the feeling of warmth that McCartney probably was feeling at the time when writing the songs from this album, because this was a really hard time for McCartney as a person. He was going through the process of accepting the fact the Beatles were no more. John left the band in September of 1969. Alan Klein was the new manager of the band against Paul McCartney's wishes, and Phil Spector was pretty much ruining every track he contributed to the Let It Be album, so it wasn't an easy time for Paul McCartney. He was going through a lot of mental health issues and mental breakdowns. It was actually thanks to Linda that he managed to overcome this really hard time in his life, and the reason why we have this album, so thank you, Linda. And if you're a Paul McCartney fan and you don't like this album, if you think that the production is too rubbish, if you think that there's barely any full songs in this record, maybe approach it with a different mindset. Think of this album as Paul McCartney trying to find his own sound, you know, Paul McCartney trying to figure out who he is outside of the Beatles. And please, let's not forget the fact that this album has some incredible compositions as well, like Once Again, Maybe I'm Amazed, one of his best ballads, Junk, Man We Was Lonely, Every Night, Teddy Boy. This album was incredibly influential for the lo-fi genre, one of the first albums made at home, if you don't count Smiley Smile by the Beach Boys. There's a bunch of things I can say in praise of this album, but ultimately this was just a wonderful beginning of an amazing trilogy and one of the most intimate albums that Paul McCartney ever released, and that's the reason why I love it so much.
Substance cannabis is a whole lot less harmful than rum punch, whiskey, nicotine, and glue, all of which are perfectly legal.
McCartney 2 has to be one of the most unique albums in Paul McCartney's discography. Here we see him trying to tackle on the new wave and synth-pop genre, and honestly, it makes a pretty weird album. Not necessarily bad, but there's definitely a lot of ideas that didn't really end up as well as McCartney thought. Where McCartney 1 works as going back to basics, McCartney 2 does the exact opposite by trying to embrace the future of music, you know, the many genres of the 80s that people like the Talking Heads were pioneering, and sometimes it works, you know, in songs like Coming Up, the dance tune that is actually one of my favorite tracks by Paul McCartney. Some other songs like Frozen Jap, for example, or One of These Days with that weird echoed production and reverb in his voice. The problem is you also have songs like Temporary Secretary and Nobody Knows, some of his worst songs that completely ruined the track list for me. I know that there's a lot of people who like these tracks, but in my opinion, you know, they're really, really bad. And listen, I'm glad that Paul McCartney is constantly trying to do new things. I'm happy that he knows how to embrace the new eras of music, but when he tries a little too hard and he forgets about what makes him Paul McCartney, that's when I think the experimentation doesn't work that well. In this album, it's clear to me that he wanted to be like those other synth pop artists that were making music that was really claustrophobic, that was not based on melody, but overall sound and instrumentation. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted his performance and his voice to go to like the back seat and allow the instrumentation and the weirdness of the sounds in this album to take the front seat, you know, to take the lead. And that's a good idea. Like, it was a good concept, but he didn't know how to do that, because the most amazing thing in a Paul McCartney album is always going to be his melodies, which is the reason why the greatest tracks in this album, Coming Up, Waterfalls, One of These Days, and Frozen Jap, are based on melody, not on instrumentation. I know that Frozen Jap is an instrumental, but the melody that he builds with the synths in that song is really, really nice and makes the song really enjoyable. But when you go to Nobody Knows, Dark Room, everything sounds so weird and out of place, then I can't even get through this album without doing something else. Like, whenever I go through the hassle of listening to this album, I'm always doing something else, playing chess on my computer, taking a shower, cooking something, but sitting down on a chair and listening to this album and not doing anything else, it's not the way I want to spend my evening. You know, it's I'm gonna be annoyed or bored. When I'm not annoyed, I'm bored. When I'm not bored, I'm annoyed, and that's not really what I want to do with my time. I do think that this is a really important part of the trilogy. Paul McCartney was going through a lot of things, the separation of wings, you know, being arrested in Japan. Like, his life was a total mess when he was recording this album, but for the most part, I think that this is probably the least enjoyable out of the three albums we have here, so yeah.
What's the secret to being 76 and still so hot?
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
I couldn't tell you how excited I was when I heard this album was going to be released. I was so deep in the lore of the Beatles. Paul McCartney was already my favorite artist of all time, so the third entry of the McCartney trilogy seemed like the greatest moment of my life. I mean, I was through the roof, and then I heard the album for the first time, and I loved every minute of it. In my opinion, this is one of the most underrated albums by Paul McCartney. The fact that he was able to produce every single song in here, with the exception of a few produced by George Martin, is impressive. It's remarkable. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking, what's the big deal? Didn't he do the same with McCartney 1 and 2? Well, technically, yeah, but the production in McCartney 1 is not that great, and in McCartney 2, the production is really, really confusing. I mean, he simply didn't know how to mix his voice with these new instrumentations he came up with. Instead, in McCartney 3, the production is masterful, from the incredibly well put together Long-Tailed Winterbird, all the way up to the sharp, distorted drums of Find My Way, to the incredible group of a song like Deep Down and Deep, Deep Feeling. There's so many positive things I can say about the production of this album, but that's not the only thing. The diversity of this album is also remarkable. Every single song in here has a different aura and atmosphere to it. That makes the record feel a little disconnected, you know, it doesn't flow that well, which is the main problem problem I have with the album, the fact that it feels more like a track list of a bunch of different experiments rather than an actual album. And that's not the case with the other two. I mean, the production may not be that great, but it flows really well thanks to the songwriting, unlike this one. But it compensates with a lot of variety, which I love. And listen, I'm by no means saying that this is one of the greatest albums ever. I don't even think it's one of the best Paul McCartney albums out there. But it's so nice and refreshing seeing Paul McCartney do something new, try new things, making music because he likes to make music, not because he has to. You know, Paul McCartney has enough money to fuck off and not worry about money for the rest of his life. And still, when faced with a lockdown, the man decides to go in the studio and make new music. And you know, the thought of that makes me so happy. And that is the reason why this album is so special to me. Once again, you have an amazing track list. For me, this is his best album since Chaos and Creation in the Backyard in 2005. And it makes me excited for a new Paul McCartney album sometime in the future, hopefully soon. But if I had to say the reason why I love this trilogy so much, it has to be because of this album. You know, it has to be because this trilogy seems to remind fans that Paul McCartney is nothing but a guy that likes to make music and likes to put out music. There's so many amazing albums by Paul McCartney out there, like Ram, Band on the Run, Venus and Mars, Flaming Pie, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. But when I want an album to make me feel like I'm at home, when I want this feeling of warmth and comfort, I go to the McCartney trilogy, because there's not a single set of albums that can make me feel so at peace and so calm like this 3 albums. And I cannot explain why. I don't know why the idea of Paul McCartney taking care of every single sound in these albums makes me feel so happy, but it does. These are my comfort albums. These albums are my happy place. And while I'm willing to recognize that they're not the greatest, you know, I wouldn't think of any of these albums as part of the greatest of all time category, but when you listen to music as often as I do, eventually you'll find an album that has quite a few flaws, but for some reason, instead of ruining the experience of the album, those flaws are going to make the album relatable and are going to place the album in a special place in your heart. And that's exactly what happened to me with the McCartney trilogy.
Hi, I'm Paul McCartney. They say it's your birthday.
And that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. This video is going to be quite different from usual. I tend to go into a lot of detail on what I like and I don't like about an album, but instead of focusing on the specifics, I wanted to make sure I explained why the McCartney trilogy was so special to me and why I think it's such a remarkable feat by Paul McCartney, and I think I did a really good job. But let me know your opinion. If you disagree with me on something I said, leave it down below in the comments.
Number 10, I'll Still Love You. Number 9, Try Some. Number 8, That Kind of Woman, Gary Moore. Information is fairly scarce about this track. Number 5, So Sad, Alvin Lee and Mylon Lefevre. The choice to hand this song to another creator strikes some as a bit odd. Number 4, Sour. Number 3. Number 2, Bad. Number 1, Rum So Far, Eric Clapton. But Badge wasn't the only time Harrison collaborated with Eric Clapton. In fact, he was even present for his solo career with this song back in 1989. Eric and George were famously good friends, despite both being in love with the same person at some point.
rising chord progression in the chorus is classic Harrison, but the melody is just too meandering and slow for me, and at 5.5 minutes, the damn song feels like it'll never end. I do like George's unexpected soul scatting in the closing bars though. Something that the US tour and his 3 prior albums had revealed to Harrison once and for all was that people simply didn't care about being God-conscious or the glory of Krishna or getting liberated from birth and death. They just didn't want to know. And George was always someone who was enthusiastic in wanting to share these life-changing discoveries to the world. So for him, this was a major blow to his psyche. And as such, Extra Texture is the only George Harrison album that is devoid of any obvious theological declarations. George is merely asking for tolerance on this album. His confidence is shaken, and there's a clear sign of defensiveness as exhibited on the song This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying, a sequel to the Beatles' epic While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
That song, it was really just like, it's a cheap excuse to play a bit of guitar. It's son of Guitar Gently Weeps.
This track is all about George defying his detractors, in this case Rolling Stone, as you can see from this none too subtle reference in the lyrics. The song also contains the lyrics, "But I'm happier than I ever been." You could have fooled me, George. It's not too bad. The guitar work in the second half is pretty decent, but the dated ARP synthesizer is far too prominent in the mix of a song that's meant to emphasize George's guitar. Prior to this album, every single that George Harrison released charted no lower than 36 on the US Billboard Hot 100. But this guitar became the first single of his to miss it entirely, the first time that had happened to any former Beatle. But ultimately it didn't matter, as the song is nowhere as memorable or stirring as the original White Album track it's based off. George's grievances with his detractors doesn't end there as we turn to the lumbering and awkward World of Stone, which is so forgettable that even after repeated listens, I was still struggle to hum this to you. That's also another major issue I have with this album. You kinda can't whistle to any of the songs. On this track, George's voice is so low in the mix it's hard to make him out. Plus, he sounds unconfident in verses, like he isn't sure he should even be singing. It's grim stuff, man. But the most downcast song on the whole album is the miserable Grey Cloudy Lies. Another example of one of George's favourite framing devices, using weather to describe his state of mind. George really loved weather metaphors. This is a really bleak affair. George later said that he was in a real down place while making the album, and you can feel it. Complete with worrying imagery of holding a pistol to his brain, there was no concealing how the man felt. George's regular bass player at the time, Klaus Voormann, left the sessions halfway through saying, quote, "In LA, I was not happy about the way George was developing, and I think he felt embarrassed about that. When they do too much cocaine, people lose their reliability. It was not the old George." This meant that Harrison played his own bass parts on many of the songs, including a Moog and ARP synth bass on the track that, coupled with the somber lyrics, make for an almost inappropriate sonic palette. Also, I've mentioned this before, I realize it's technically pronounced Moog, but I feel like the common pronunciation is Moog, so I'm just gonna keep saying Moog. One of the more enjoyable elements of the album is George's attempt at incorporating some Miracles-inspired soul into the songs. Like on the track Ooh Baby You Know That I Love You, a tribute to Smokey Robinson, the first of 2 in his career.
I just realised that one of my favourite singers has been Smokey Robinson as a songwriter also.
It's a sweet and sensual number where George keeps up a falsetto voice for much of the track, going full soul. But ultimately isn't able to dredge this tribute out from under the malaise that so afflicts Extra Texture. The soul music continues on Can't Stop Thinking About You. I can't stop thinking about you. You know, Paul McCartney was often the one criticised for overly sentimental lyrics and sappy songs, but George could pump them out just as easily, sometimes going even further into full melodrama as showcased by the melody and lyrics in this track. Speaking of Lennon and McCartney, the two of them never really demonstrated that much interest or proficiency at soul music, compared to Harrison, who showed a real knack for it and experimented with the genre as much as he did folk in the early 70s, so props to him. Have you ever had one of those nights where you went out and you wish you didn't? George Harrison sure did, as he sings in one of the better cuts on the album, Tired of Midnight Blue. This is a fairly robust blues track with plenty of cowbell, hand claps, moody guitar riffs, and great piano work from Leon Russell. This song gives an insight into the seedy elements of the drug-fueled LA music scene that George was realizing he wanted no part in. It's fine, but I can't pretend I listen to it all that much. The album closes with an eye roll of a track titled His Name is Legs, ladies and gentlemen. This overly long bit of throwaway just feels like a joke I'm not in on. George even admitted it was for one or maybe two people. It's about a guy called Legs Larry Smith, who played in the English comedy act The Bonzo Dog Doodah Band.
All the little pigs, they grunt and howl, the cats meow, the dogs bow wow.
And sounds like he was just one of those quirky guys that had a court jester effect on George. It was the beginning of George's inclusion of Python-esque references in his music, which would develop over the coming years. The lyrics are already esoteric and nonsensical, and because of the cluttered mix, you can't really make out what Harrison is even saying about him, nor discern much from the spoken word moments from Smith himself. An unfunny comedy track that's too little too late anyway, after the listener has been put in the most dour of moods thanks to nearly every song prior to this closer. So that's Extra Texture, a lugubrious, arrhythmic record with mushy production that does not at all reflect the cheeky album artwork or vibrant title. Even George would go on to call this a grubby album years later. George Harrison was someone incapable of masking his emotions in his music, which was ultimately one of his greatest strengths as a songwriter and singer. But here you really worry for him. After this album though, he headed back to England with his new girlfriend, Olivia Arias, and thankfully the remainder of the 70s were a big improvement for both George and his music. But as for me, this album's only getting a measly 5 out of 10. Okay, it's time to loosen up a bit. The early 80s was a time that found many 60s and 70s rock stars in the musical wilderness. With new wave, post-punk and dance pop ringing through the airwaves, many fading stars couldn't seem to find their footing in this radically changing world.
Now what's the matter, buddy? Ain't you heard of my school?
Combine this with the oil crisis of the late 70s, bringing on a recession that rippled out to the music industry, where label heads were anxious that their artists' music wouldn't be commercial enough to play on radio, and so pressured musicians to focus on writing hits. This was the unfortunate place George Harrison found himself when putting songs together for his first album of the 1980s, Somewhere in England. After his sunny and upbeat self-titled LP from 1979, George continued his creative streak, returning to a theme in his music that he'd kept relatively concealed for the last 6 years: his spirituality. By October 1980, he'd compiled a lovely set of songs to present to head of Warner Brothers Records, Mo Ostin. However, in a first for any ex-Beatle, Ostin rejected the album on the grounds of it being too laid back, not modern enough, and lacking in commercial viability. And this is after George wrote and recorded a song dedicated to him. Ostin even vetoed the terrific album artwork, only to have it replaced with this generic shot. Thank God it's since been reinstated, because this is one of the best album covers of George Harrison's career. To try and maximize profits as much as possible, Warner Brothers had been running focus groups and street polling to find out what constituted a hit single, coming to the conclusion that it was a song of love gained or lost between 14 to 20-year-olds. In George Harrison's own words, he said, "Shit, what chance does that give me?" George reluctantly acquiesced and agreed to replace 4 of the songs with more radio-friendly bops. This is actually kind of devastating, because the songs that were removed were some of Harrison's strongest compositions of the 1980s. These include Flying Hour, a jaunty track about living in the present; Sat Singing, a touching and personal song about meditation; Lay His Head, a sweet and beguiling tune about finding solitude; and finally Tears of the World, a song condemning ecological devastation and big business that foreshadowed the calamity of climate change. The original album was to be released in November 1980, however George had no choice but to return to the studio, where he enlisted the help of Ray Cooper to help produce some new tracks, delaying the album to 1981. This whole situation saw George channel his frustrations into the opening track of the album, Blood from a Clone, a musing on how every song needed to sound more or less the same for it to be a hit. George apes the sound of popular music with a ska beat, windy synths, and some steel drum for good measure. The lyrics are incredibly specific and more or less a fuck you to Warner Brothers for making him do this in the first place, which I do respect. I do listen to this track, I think it's enjoyable enough, it just gets the album off to a rather nihilistic start. If Blood from a Clone was going after the music business, then the next track, Unconsciousness Rules, goes straight for the very people who consume these same formulaic radio hits. Yeah, George was really in his curmudgeon era on this one. I mean, these lyrics are biting. You dance at the discotheque, that's why you look such a wreck, your face is pale, you look drawn, your clothes are dirty and torn. I do think that with all the partying of the 60s and 70s and all the benders that he's been on, it's a bit rich from George to condemn the new generation of young people who are just trying to enjoy their Saturday Night Fever disco craze.
You know all his lines about I was never at a discotheque? Well, I wasn't. You had to drag him out to them, you know?
The thing about this track, though, is that I'm just not absorbing George's bitter takes on young people because the song is just too damn catchy. Like, the band's put in some really stellar work here. It's a bit of a throwback to the sounds of his 1976 album, which means it's not exactly fresh, but I like it. It's poppy and it's scathing, but without being a downer. Yeah, probably the best track of the revised 1981 editions. Now, the added twist of fate of Somewhere in England being delayed till 1981 is that John Lennon was murdered in December of 1980, which shone an unexpected spotlight on whatever singles George Harrison was to release the next year. This meant that Harrison reluctantly scored his highest charting single in years, with All Those Years Ago peaking at number 2 in the States and 13 in the UK. This also boosted album sales, even grazing the top 10 spots all around the world, 2 feats he hadn't accomplished since 1973. Before Lennon was killed, All Those Years Ago was a song that Harrison was going to give to Ringo Starr, but after laying down the drum track and vocals, Starr wasn't satisfied with it and the song was left unfinished. After Lennon's death, Harrison kept the drum track but wrote new words dedicated to John Lennon, which does mean that there's a certain dissonance between the simple, peppy, snap beat and the more solemn lyrics. Underneath it all is a moving tribute from George to John. Paul McCartney's tribute, Here Today, is a personal song between the songwriting pair, a conversation about what they meant to each other, and it's a real tearjerker.
I love you.
George's, on the other hand, is about what John Lennon actually brought to the world, why he mattered. But you point the way to the truth when you say, all you need is love. You are the one who imagined it all.
I always looked up to you.
George met Paul as a schoolyard equal, but he did always look up to John, and despite him being, in George's words,
John Lennon is a saint and he's heavy duty and he's great and I love him, but at the same time he's such a bastard.
He is, sure.
But that's the great thing about him, you see.
you said it all, though not many had ears. You had control of our smiles and our tears. I mean, guys. Beautiful message, and you've even got Paul and Linda McCartney on backing vocals, plus Denny Lane from Wings, which makes it a rare release where 3 Beatles played on the one track, but perhaps because it's George and Paul, I can barely hear McCartney in the mix. Like, even Linda is coming through more clearly. A touching, if not fully realised, tribute. George's second and only other single from the album is the Elton John-like Teardrops, that features a cheesy 80s infomercial-sounding intro. Be the envy of all your friends with Somewhere in England by George Harrison. This is an otherwise enjoyable power pop packet with a decent hook and up-tempo beat, exactly what Warner Brothers was hoping Harrison would produce. But because of that, plus the generic lyrics about a love lost, this can really only be described as a hack piece from George Harrison, perhaps the first of his career. A tune made out of obligation only, which makes it hard to enjoy authentically. Something else I notice about Teardrops is George's voice seems to have gone through a strange development. You can hear it in the verses here especially.
He talks so sweet, but the news is always much the same.
He talks sweet, bub. What is that? It sounds like a bad Bob Dylan impression. Needless to say, Teardrops didn't become the hit it was designed to be, even with the glare of Lennon's death. The lesson being, let George Harrison make whatever music he friggin' wants to. We gave up sat singing for Teardrops? The guitarist also found himself going back to his early roots on this album with 2 covers by Hoagy Carmichael, one of his favourite artists. These are straight up skips for me. I find them so boring. Baltimore Oriole is just a snooze fest with Muzak-like saxophone and a lugubrious tempo. And I'm sure if I had heard Carmichael's Hong Kong Blues on the radio in the late 40s like Harrison did as a 5-year-old,
He got 20 years privilege taken away from him.
this cover might be more endearing, but I just can't get around this rather dull snippet of Harrison nostalgia. Something I can get around is Harrison's beautiful and personal ballad, Life Itself, featuring multiple clean guitar parts plus his usual slide, blossoming backing vocals, and some tasteful Hammond organ. This song is actually a holdout from the other mystical tracks that were unfortunately cut from the album, but we're lucky we managed to keep this one, which has so much care and love in it. It's a love song to the higher power in George's life, who at different points he calls a lover, a friend, and a source of truth. It features a beautiful counter-melody guitar solo that is a perfect example of what author Simon Lang describes as a song within the song. The song served as the artist's most overtly religious assertion since 1974. George really lets us inside his soul here. Perhaps becoming a parent helped give him the strength to write from this place again. This is George's spiritual vision set to music. This is what he's about, what he's always been about, and it's a privilege to be invited into his inner world again. Elsewhere on the album we have the song That Which I Have Lost, the last of the additional 1981 tracks. A curious song about George wanting to illuminate his consciousness with a country twang to it, and features simple acoustic strumming, quirky synths, and some unexpected tuba. Add in the clumsy lyrics, the tepid energy, and you've got a song that just doesn't quite coalesce for me. Similarly, the track Writings on the Wall is another spiritually adjacent number. It's George musing on one's own existence and features a welcome return of Indian instruments like the gub-gubby, tabla, and gentle sitar drone. But even though it sounds pretty, the melody returns to that old meandering territory and the song just doesn't have a lot of staying power for me. George closes the album with his first song of ecological protest, which is a theme that he would return to 20 years later on his final record. Up to this point, George wasn't one to reference specific issues of the world in his music, with the exception of Bangladesh. But here he's fighting for the planet and its children's future, and I fully welcome this effort. However, unlike the stirring protest songs of the 60s, this composition is so jarringly quirky, you don't realize how important and prophetic the messages of this song are. It's where the influence of Monty Python really peaks for George Harrison, who had recently put up £3 million to fund their film, Life of Brian.
And he'd mortgaged his house to put up the money for this movie because he wanted to see it. Which is still the most anybody's ever paid for a cinema ticket.
This protest song in question, called Save the World, features sound effects of bombs going off, cash registers, and general noisy machinery. Kinda reminds me of the Paul McCartney song Average Person, which is probably not what you want when it comes to fighting against a nuclear arms race, wildlife devastation, and corporate greed. An admirable track, but baffling execution that I attribute to George's knack for using humour to offset otherwise depressing topics. Somewhere in England is a fairly bitter turn from Harrison's more recent efforts, but could you really blame him? He had quite a decent album ready to go, but even as an ex-Beatle was told it wasn't good enough and that he had to go make music for teenagers. This generated a mixed album featuring flashes of sincerity and beauty, tedious 1940s covers, catchy but resentful power pop packets, and ruminations on existence that are decent at best. Suffice it to say, George made no effort to promote the album and so retreated further into his own spiritual shell inside his gothic mansion, becoming more at peace with his status as an out-of-touch rocker from yesteryear. That idealistic spirit of the 60s that lingered throughout the 70s had finally bitten the dust. 6 out of 10. After the painful back and forth process of releasing 1981's Somewhere in England, George Harrison had lost practically all interest in the music business. His real focus was elsewhere, namely helping to save the British film industry with his production and distribution company, Handmade Films. Its first release, Monty Python's Life of Brian, was a huge success, with George's efforts to rescue the film easily paying off. Handmade Films would go on to make a few more hits like With Nail and I in 1987, as well as a few flops, ultimately disintegrating around the early 90s. But back in 1982, Handmade Films was George Harrison's primary focus.
Well, my role is I pop in and out, I hear what's happening day to day, I make any suggestions I can.
And he was keen to properly liberate himself from the music business. George had one remaining album on his Warner Brothers record contract. He was essentially in the same situation as he was back in 1975 with the release of Extra Texture liberating him from Apple and EMI. His approach to recording them was going to be a casual affair with his mostly English mates for his own amusement. If people liked what he made, great, but that didn't matter to George anymore. Inspired by guitar virtuoso Ry Cooder's recent work with a talented trio of black doo-wop vocalists, Harrison enlisted these three fellas to come sing backup on the album. He also reused the production help of Ray Cooper, as well as former Beatles engineer Phil McDonald. The content of the new album would be inspired by Harrison's other passion of the early 1980s, Going on holiday. Harrison was often seen both in Maui, Hawaii, and in northern parts of Australia, which opened him up to this breezy South Sea tropical sound, resulting in the 1982 release of the next album on our list, Gone Troppo. Man, this has got to be the worst album artwork for any of George's, for any ex-Beatle even. Well, I say that like this monstrosity doesn't exist. Seriously though, I feel like I'm having an aneurysm every time I look at this. And you know who designed it? Legs Larry Smith, that friggin' guy that George made that weird song about at the end of Extra Texture. Well, I guess he had the last laugh because yikes. Anyway, what do we have on here? Once again, opening the album with a bit of panache, the song Wake Up My Love zooms into our ears with that same cheesy 80s infomercial vibe as on Teardrops, except this intro sounds more like if the news was a musical. Good evening and welcome to tonight's top stories. It's really not a bad track, and the twin synth, slide guitar work, and the chorus sounds contemporary and cool, plus the overall hook is pretty exciting. It's a bit more interesting than Teardrops because the lyrics convey a desire for Harrison to find love, God's love in this case. Years earlier, Harrison learned that classical Indian music was written and performed with the express purpose of connecting with God. This was something that Harrison infused in his own music, with early songs like My Sweet Lord and Awaiting on You All, and inspired this fun quote, "Music should be used for the perception of God, not jitterbugging." But now, a decade on from those early compositions, George is out here again asking for God's love, but this isn't the same God tenderly singing "Give me love, give me peace on earth." This guy's more anxious and bitter towards the material world. He's run out of patience and he's yelling, "Well, you know it's me out here. Can't give up now, let us make that clear. All I've had's the run around." I'm barking like some hound. His later use of the word Christ borders on an expletive instead of a yearning plea. Christ, I'm looking for some light. This very much speaks to George's relationship to his spirituality at the time. His belief and faith remained intact, but the last 10 years knocked him round a bit, having even less hope for humanity than ever before. This existentialist view of society is also reflected in the song That's the Way It Goes, one of the album highlights. To me, this is one of Harrison's most McCartney-esque compositions, featuring miniature fables of three men who all suffer from some sort of ego-driven illusion of the material 1980s. One obsessed with stocks and shares, one with buying up land in South Africa, and the third a fame-hungry actor. But where in earlier songs, Harrison may have sought to convert them to his spiritual vision by chanting the names of the Lord, he's now resigned to accept that this is the way the greedy world is now. That's the way it goes. That's the way it goes. This evolution in George's worldview makes this a fascinating song, but it's also one of the more musically engaging tracks on the album as well. The instrumental breaks are rich and inviting, made up of George's slide guitar. The track also features Willie Green, one of the three African-American backup singers. Green has an ultra bassy, deep harmony that I always find just a smidge unsettling. Feel his clouds, he can stoop so low. He uses this bass voice for the next track, a cover of the Stereo's early 60s doo-wop song, I Really Love You. This song is bizarre. Musically, it's a pretty obvious recreation of the doo-wop style, but there's something a little off-kilter about it. I don't know. Like, if you didn't know this was a George song, you'd have no way of guessing it was his. He has instrumental tracks that are easier to recognize thanks to his slide guitar, which of course doesn't appear in this. He doesn't even sing the lead melody line, his voice is just one of the many in the backup harmony. Well, babe, you know I love you so. Not an unpleasant song, just an odd choice. We then get a laid-back, more or less instrumental track on Grease. No. Like the country. Aside from the odd geographical wordplay like Yugoslavia, half past Armenia, this track is made up of mostly a series of twangy and bright guitars that offer a chilled out mood. A bit of filler, but a relaxed, sunny time all the same. The warm, coastal mood continues on the delightful album track. From the cheeky opening guitar passage to the riding off into the sunset finish, this is one of the better cuts off of Gone Troppo. George wrote this song while holidaying in Australia, which is where the expression comes from, to go mad from tropical heat.
Mr. Speaker, he's going Troppo. Going Troppo.
And there's a decent amount of zaniness on this track, let me tell you. The lyrics bring to mind tropical imagery like the high-wide Moreton Bay fig and eating a papaya. It's time you know I got Troppo. I just really enjoy the spirit of this song. It's got some exotic instrumentation with George playing a series of Indian bowls called the Jal Tarang. plus plenty of marimba and other Pacific percussive instruments. That was a mouthful. I can see a lot of people hating this song, but I find its corniness somewhat irresistible. Counting the fruit back, it's all very silly, but at least stays authentic to the bonkers album artwork. Also, this is a silly album. It's pure goofa-loofa. It has a fruity sound and dopey production. It's George Harrison's Pipes of Peace, which were only 11 months apart, so maybe George inspired Paul with some of the silliness, who knows? A running theme in George Harrison's work is his insistence that he's not the person or the idea of the person that you think he once was, such as on earlier songs like The Light That Has Lighted the World. But where this used to be a plea for his own peace, he's now at the point where he accepts his bizarre status in the world as a living legend, which he explores in the charming song Mystical One. This jaunty guitar track, awash with mandolins, sees George reflect on his life and surmise that he's happiest sitting by a stream, highlighting George's evergreen theme of his connection to nature. It's a gratifying song. It even features a goofy vocoder effect in the chorus, but I kind of enjoy it, at least on this track. I highly recommend listening to the gorgeous acoustic demo of this track as well. It's completely different without all the bells and whistles, and it's more reminiscent of the songs from his 1970 output. Whilst coming up with songs to compile this new album and finish his contract, George got stuck thinking of ideas until his wife Olivia suggested he write one about their young child Danny, which became Unknown Delight. With echoes of his Abbey Road hit Something, Unknown Delight is a beguiling song that sees George broach a new kind of personal muse, singing about his son and the darkest deep brown eyes I've ever seen. It's so genuinely beautiful and refreshing to hear George, the last of all the Beatles to become a dad, sing so openly about his child and how he freshens all around with all the love he brings. This is one of the songs I could have done without the other backup singers. I usually love multi-part harmonies, but that, again, super bassy voice sounds a little intrusive on this very personal dedication from a father to a son. I think the production just overwhelms the sentiment. The production in general is my major complaint about this album. The choice of super clean, broad harmonies with obnoxious 80s synth and vocoder is just an uncomfortable fusion of sounds for me. I think there's a lot of beauty in many of these songs that gets undermined by this glossy exterior. Nowhere is this more invasive than on the nightmarish album track Baby Don't Run Away. It begins with this alarming opening vocal that sounds like it was designed to frighten children. Baby, don't run away from me. Unlike in Mystical One, the vocoder sits right alongside the deep and weird lead vocal from George and doesn't go away. The chord progression is absolutely wretched. Like, George, I know you like weird chords, but what are you doing here, man? The overblown moog effects and the cringe vocoder is just clown car buffoonery. Then the verse quietens down before you hit with another it's excruciating. My least favorite George Harrison song. Thank God the next track is just pure basic pop fun with much more tolerable production. This may be because the song was actually written for the handmade film Time Bandits, where it played over the end credits. I haven't actually seen the film, but the song has that feel-good cheerfulness perfectly suited for the end of a fun family adventure film. George closes the album with an old Beatles throwback, Circles. This was a song Harrison wrote in Rishikesh, India in 1968 when the Beatles were under the tutelage of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and was included in the Isha demos, a series of earlier takes that would eventually become the White Album. Back in 1968, George used a creepy harmonium to test out the track. Friends come and friends go, which ultimately never moved past his living room until 1982 on Gone Troppo. This composition is a grower. At first listen, it's an ooky spooky oddity from George. Friends come and friends go, as I go round and round. Like, no song will kill a good vibe quicker, but if you're in the mood for it, this is a super intriguing offering from George. It's got an early 80s moodiness to it in the spirit of Joy Division, but the truth is this is a totally unique song. Revolving dissonant chords circle your ears as if to put you in a state of hypnosis. In circles. It's explicitly about reincarnation and features a quote from Lao Tzu that's very George. He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know. Gloomy as heck, but not a bad cut. Gone Troppo is somewhat of a contradictory album. It's George making sunny, jovial music for his own amusement, but it's also a record made begrudgingly to see out the end of a contract. This makes it hard to get wrapped up in the positive vibes of the album, knowing that much of this was a chore for Harrison. It's a shame the production's synthetic glaze spoils much of the richness of the songwriting, because there's plenty to enjoy on here, as well as moments that feel like I'm in a fever dream. Once again, Harrison had no interest in promoting the album, resulting in it not even breaking into the US Billboard 100, a rare feat considering that every other of his solo albums made it into at least the top 20. George Harrison was seemingly done with making albums altogether. It would be another 5 years before he made another, his longest gap so far. It's quite close in quality to Somewhere in England, but I do think it's a tad better, so I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 10. Whew, all this warm tropical chat has got me feeling pretty hot. In the hill corner, the highway, modern Vic, Gone Troppo. In the years after Gone Troppo, George was content with his role as movie producer and gardener, with next to no musical contributions anywhere.
And what's your ambition for Handmade now?
Handmade? I don't have many ambitions at all. Not for Handmade, not for anything really. I think ambition is something you have to try and get rid of.
He'd lend the occasional guitar part to some other artist's record, or the odd song for a film soundtrack, but it was mostly a quiet period for the guitar maestro. His main musical appearances were where he could surround himself with other musicians, such as on the incredible Carl Perkins HBO Rockabilly concert, where people like Harrison, Clapton, Dave Edmunds, Ringo Starr, and more gathered together to play some classic Carl Perkins hits in celebration of his song Blued Suede Shoes turning 30. It's an amazing concert and features the happiest George Harrison has ever looked on stage. He's playing guitar alongside his childhood hero, and it's so genuinely heartwarming to see George connect back to the music that first turned him onto guitar and rock and roll. As the mid-80s became the late 80s, the has-been status attributed to the rock stars of the 50s and 60s was shifting into something grander. The 30-year cycle of pop culture was heading towards its first closed loop, as the classic rock sound was rising in popularity, and these middle-aged men were now being viewed as legends. Around this time, George appeared at a couple of concerts, one in Birmingham and the other for the Prince's Trust. Both gigs featured ELO's Jeff Lynne, whom George Harrison had become friends with over the 80s, even going on holiday to Australia together. Cute. These recent casual gigs with friends showed George that making music could be fun again, and so enlisted Jeff Lynne's help to co-produce his first album in 5 years, and the next on our list, the highly successful Cloud 9. Now I know what you're thinking, isn't Cloud 9 a little low on the list? Sure, to many this is an obvious top 2 or 3 spot, and I still think it's good. It's a fine album, but you need to understand that I didn't grow up with this record. Cloud 9 was George Harrison's comeback smash. He did tons of promotion for it, music videos, interviews.
Oh yeah, my new album's much better than anything the Beatles ever did.
Plus for Gen Xers who were young and perhaps discovering the Beatles for the first time, this was the album by an ex-Beatle that they could enjoy alongside their parents on their newly minted CD player. Basically, this is a beloved LP by many. But just keep in mind that you're watching a review from someone who listened to it for the first time very much as an adult. Please don't come for me. Let's just dive in. From the opening bars of the title track, we are hearing a George Harrison who's finally acquiesced to the accessible music of the day. If we didn't have George Harrison's slide guitar and his voice, this could be a Tom Petty or Peter Gabriel track. The snare and bass drum is fashionably prominent in the mix, and there's a bright metallic sound to the guitars. Harrison's voice is deeper and more rugged than before. Have my love. And the lyrics are uncharacteristically cryptic in a way that only makes this bluesy song less and not more compelling for me. Combine this with the heavy production from Jeff Lynne, and I find this track all but eliminates Harrison's personality, save for some skillful guitar interplay between him and Eric Clapton, who offers up his talents on a number of tracks here. I know people dig this song, but for me, sorry, it's just a little too generic. This is followed up with That's What It Takes, a slightly more interesting song with plenty of George's famous odd chord progressions in the pre-chorus. It features a lovely slide guitar solo with, again, a metallic quality to the production. I don't know how else to describe it. We've got some 80s reverb and clean harmonies, clearly with Jeff Lynne on backing vocals, which I'm sure never stopped being a thrill for him. Yeah, the song is okay, it's sweet and everything, but I'm not on Cloud 9 just yet. The third track, Fish on the Sand, is finally where the album starts to capture my attention. It's got a terrific opening guitar riff that's very Beatles. In fact, this entire number chugs along with an early 60s rock energy that I love. The harmonies are on point and the yearning in George's voice is very potent. The catchiness of the song, though, is deceptive, as the lyrics spell out some serious self-doubt in Harrison's faith. In classic Harrison fashion, this pseudo-love song conveys an ambiguity where it could be about a woman, but a keen listener of Harrison's music would know that this is God swimming by his teardrops. And by comparing this absence of faith to feeling like a fish on the sand is admittedly very funny imagery. I'm not so much of a man, I'm like a fish on the sand. Which also gives this track a terrific balance of humor and pathos. Like, this could be my favorite track off of Cloud 9. Oh, and there's also a really excellent cover of the song by the band Ah La Las, who lean into a more 60s psych sound. Really good stuff. Harrison also has a number of slower ballads on this album, beginning with Just for Today, a song George wrote after reading a pamphlet from one of his many friends battling addiction, namely alcohol.
So they're not allowed to drink, you see. I can drink large quantities of wine and things because I'm not an alcoholic. But they gave me this little thing, and it's a brochure from AA. It says, just for today, you know, don't worry about everything, just deal with one thing at a time, basically. So I thought, well, that sounds nice, and I just wrote that tune about it.
This song can also be viewed as a tribute to all those that Harrison had lost to addiction and a balm for those still in the throes of it. The track features some truly gorgeous guitar solos and also a low hum of backing vocals, giving it a liturgical quality. If just for... Another of these slower compositions is the inviting Someplace Else. This is a reworked song from the handmade film Shanghai Surprise, starring Sean Penn and Madonna, that sounds like it was a disaster to make and watch.
Do you want the truth? It was a pain in the ass.
Someplace Else is not so awful.
You got into my life, I don't know how you found me.
It's a tender guitar ballad with a thankfully more minimal arrangement than the overblown production that afflicts the rest of the album. The other song, regrooved from the Shanghai Surprise soundtrack, is Breath Away from Heaven. In George's words, it's
slightly Chinese sounding. Well, it was supposed to be just slightly Chinese sounding.
For what it's worth, the lyrics of this song are pure Harrison poetry. I woke up dreaming with a sigh as the morning light was painting whispers of a joy. This whole song creates a mysterious mood with peculiar chord progressions and vivid imagery, but I often think there's just not enough to keep me invested. Returning to the poppier numbers on the record, we have the ELO sounding This Is Love, a charming up-tempo track co-written by Jeff Lynne. It includes a rare taste of a wah-wah pedal on George's usually clean guitar sound. I like the galloping verses and those vocals are a cute touch. It's a very Beatles-esque single that also features a joyful music video of George in Hawaii finally looking comfortable playing the part of an 80s pop star. But arguably the most Beatles-esque song on the album is When We Was Fab. This is a weird one for me because I really should like it. It's George finally dipping back into an intentional Beatles sound, making lyrical and sonic references to his old band. But one can't help but feel that this is just Jeff Lynne living out his Beatles fantasy. Hot take, I know. Lynne, who co-wrote the track, is a humongous Beatles fan, whose vision for his band ELO was to pick up where the Beatles left off in 1970.
You know, when I heard ELO, it was very what we'd been doing on Sgt. Pepper.
He would go on to helm his ultimate Beatles project, producing the Anthology in the mid-90s, and later McCartney's Flaming Pie album. And hey, I can't blame the guy. If I was producing for George Harrison, I'd also want to geek out with my Beatles tribute song as much as possible. But this is hardly a tribute. The lyrics spell out Harrison's dismay more than his joy at Beatlemania. The listener might not pick up on this though, as the song is filled with I Am the Walrus cellos, occasional sitar, and both Ringo Starr's drum fills and Beatle harmonies with Jeff Lynne. The whole song has a murky quality to it, and George's vocals also sound like they're coming through an AM radio, and I don't know, I just don't think this song sounds all that authentic to him. The single landed him a #2 spot on the US Billboard charts, but I think that's more to do with it being a Beatles throwback than it being a quality recording. But never mind a #2 spot, because finally, after 14 years, George Harrison scored his third US #1 with I Got My Mind Set On You. Written by Rudy Clark and originally recorded by James Ray in 1962. I've got my mind set on you. I've got my mind set on you. George Harrison covers this peppy track with a pounding drum beat and a flurry of saxophones. This also features a passionate vocal from Harrison, something missing from his follow-up single When We Was Fab. It's one of the songs on the album where I think they really nailed it on the production. This rock reinterpretation of a smooth R&B number sounds just excellent. They even made 2 different music videos for it, but in my personal opinion, it has suffered slightly from incessant radio play. My local rock and classic hit stations pretty much only play this George Harrison song. Like, out of his entire discography, you only ever hear Got My Mind Set on You. This was also a hit in the UK, spending 4 weeks at the number 2 spot. A welcome return for George, as his home country had never embraced his solo work quite like the US had. And to date, this is the last time that an ex-Beatle scored a number 1 hit single in the US. You hear that, Paul? There's still time, buddy. A track that I've really grown to like is Devil's Radio, which was inspired by a church billboard George saw in an English country town that said,
Gossip, the Devil's Radio, don't be a broadcaster.
I know people found a lot of George's proclamations about God or society to be a bit preachy, but it's part of what I love about him, his point of view on things. And this is quite the rant, let me tell you, probably the most worked up he's been since Wah Wah.
It's white and black like industrial waste, pollution of the
In a rockabilly fashion, he attacks gossip, TV, cynical talk radio, which spreads inaccuracies and falsehoods. I wonder what kind of people that could apply to today. It's one of those prophetic George Harrison songs that just makes you really think how much he'd hate social media. It's also one of the rare occasions where George admitted to being inspired by contemporary musical trends, in this case, the stylings of Eurythmics. Harrison also goes after gossip columnists in the track Wreck of the Hesperus, but his main target in this fast-paced rocker is himself. In the funniest song on the album, George playfully laments that he's no spring chicken, he's been plucked but he's still kicking. A self-deprecating number exploring a midlife crisis could be seen as a bit too cute by half, but it's saved by the upbeat rock stylings of the entire band, particularly Ringo Starr's excellent drumming. Like I said at the top of this review, this is a good album. The songwriting's quite strong and George is sounding terrific. There's also no song that's truly terrible like on previous LPs, but there's 2 things preventing me from really loving it. The first is the dated production. That late 80s sound that had a chokehold on artists everywhere is just not my thing. It's the same problem I had with Paul McCartney's Flowers in the Dirt album from 1989. Although I will say now, if I may digress for a moment, start the clock, I was too harsh on Flowers in the Dirt. I was grading Paul's albums on somewhat of a curve due to the sheer size of his output, but it deserves higher than a 5 out of 10. Songs I didn't mention like Distractions, We Got Married, and Put It There are really lovely, so there you have it. So yeah, it's Cloud9's production, and the second thing that's preventing me from truly embracing this album is the lack of authentic confessional music from George, something that is prevalent on every single other record he's ever made. We get the odd angry rant, and songs like Fish on the Sand and Just for Today skim the surface of his inner mind, but mostly I feel like I'm listening to George Harrison at a distance. And with basically no acoustic guitars on the entire LP and Jeff Lynne crowding up the joint, sonically, I'm feeling more removed from George than ever. But still, not a bad LP at all, and it gave him his last US number 1, so I can't complain that much. Yeah, 7 out of 10. And that pretty much ties a bow on George's 1980s studio album discography. Yeah, I've already covered every record from the decade. He still made engaging music during this period, but as you're about to find out, the 1970s was just a more musically rewarding and fun time as far as I'm concerned. Except for Extra Texture, no one was having fun there. The next album on the list is Dark Horse. Now you might be thinking, nah, no way, this guy's a moron, how could he possibly think Dark Horse is better than Cloud9? Guys, it's in the name. It's a dark horse. Let me just set the scene, okay? By the end of 1973, George had easily eclipsed John and Paul as the most successful ex-Beatle. He had 2 number 1 albums with 2 corresponding number 1 singles, plus a world-first charity benefit gig under his belt. One may have found themselves pondering the question the Beatles were asked ad nauseum in the 60s, when was the bubble going to burst? Well, it turns out 1974 was George's turn to take a flogging. Never one to waste time, George announced to his wife Patty that they should have a divorce this year at Ringo Starr's 1973-74 New Year's Eve party, which I would say was a pretty bad omen for things to come. The marriage had been falling apart since the end of the last decade, which Eric Clapton noticed, and after years of failed attempts was finally able to woo Patty Boyd.
I had become, bit by bit, more and more obsessed with his wife, Patty, and was making amateur kind of inroads into finding out what was going on and what was happening to their relationship.
George was no saint himself, though. While his own marriage was breaking down, he had an affair with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen, and to add more fuel to the incestuous fire, he and Ronnie Wood of the Faces, later of the Rolling Stones, swapped wives for a brief period. Not sure how that all works, but it was the 70s, and I'll just leave it there. As a result of his womanizing, George's commitment to his Hindu faith was wavering, which wasn't helped by an overly indulgent dependency on drugs and alcohol, particularly cocaine. This was all part of what George called his naughty period. He did, however, make an excellent album in 1974. It just wasn't his. You see, as a way of forgetting his relationship troubles, George completely overcommitted to his work, which included producing the forgotten gem and one of Apple Records' best discoveries, The Place I Love from the band Splinter. Look at these two dorks. These guys right here? They made a great album. By the time this album was ready, it was going to be released on Harrison's new record label instead of Apple, yet another venture which took up a lot of time. But seriously, go and listen to The Place I Love. It's got George's stamp all over it, and it's just overflowing with Beatle influence. Maybe I'll make a Patreon video about this album and maybe the other albums that George produced. Oh yeah, I have a Patreon. If you'd like to join, the link is in the description. I'd really appreciate it. Okay, thanks. Now back to the review. This was just one of the many albums that Harrison produced in 1974, adding to Shankar Family and Friends, plus a live album of Indian music from a tour of musicians that Harrison also put together with Shankar.
Produced 2 albums, gone to India, it's got all these 18 musicians together, brought them to England, rehearsed them in my house, got them, filmed them on the Albert Hall, we made their album, toured Europe.
And to top it all off, George finished the year with a tour of America, making him the first ex-Beatle to play a run of shows in the United States. Only there was a slight problem. Because he was such a mensch and overcommitted himself to other people's projects, plus all the coke and brandy he was consuming, George Harrison contracted laryngitis and lost his voice on the eve of the tour.
What I feel, I can't say.
This tour, though enjoyed by audiences around the country, received some horrible reviews from major publications like Rolling Stone, who took issue with 3 key areas: Harrison's heavy inclusion of Indian music, his own ragged vocals, and particularly his refusal to pander to Beatles fans with barely any Fab Four songs on the setlist. This led critics like Robert Kreisgau of The Village Voice to nickname the poor guitarist Horstalk, which is admittedly very funny. After the tour was over by the end of December, Harrison was on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
And was trying to make my own album in time to get to America and do a tour. I just had too much on.
And returned to England barely able to open the door of his own home.
After that, I'll probably just collapse. I don't know.
And somewhere in between all those events, he hastily threw together his own album, released towards the end of the tour, which just so happens to be the next on our list, the misunderstood Dark Horse. I said it wasn't excellent. It's not. But let me tell you why Dark Horse is pretty good, actually. First of all, possibly my favorite album artwork from George Harrison's discography. There he is. There's our boy. Many writers over the years have often compared the album to a musical soap opera. Even George Harrison himself likened it to one. Quote, "I'm a musician, not a talker. I mean, if you just get my album,
it's like Peyton Place. You know, it'll tell you exactly what I've been doing. One's called So Sad, one's called Simply Shady."
Part of why I like Dark Horse is this element of personal drama. And if this album really is like a soap opera, then the first track, Hari's on Tour, is the opening credits when all the cast is introduced. This is a rare instrumental from George that features Joni Mitchell's backing band, the LA Express, who recorded this impromptu after Harrison invited them to Friar Park. This casual approach of various musicians playing at his home studio adds to the sonic mishmash of Dark Horse. No longer did Harrison require his usual discipline bound by expensive London studio schedules. Things became much more loose and relaxed, but this more laid-back atmosphere, plus having no co-producer, cut back on overall consistency and quality. But George wasn't here to be this spiritual superstar anymore. He just wanted to be one of the guys in a band, and that's what you get with this first track, which opened every live show and corresponds to the very fun atmosphere George and the gang were actually having on tour.
But it was still brilliant because that band was unbelievable.
We then arrive at a trifecta of songs that all tell the story of Harrison's state of mind during his marriage breakdown. First we have Simply Shady, and from those very first growling words, it's clear George's vocals aren't in a good spot.
Somebody brought the juicer,
As on Extra Texture, this track is filled with plenty of melodrama, both in the melody and the lyrics, with George once associating this track with the BBC radio drama Mrs. Dale's Diary. Musically, Simply Shady may be a bit plodding, but the lyrics are a fascinating insight into George's internal struggle with his failing marriage and infidelities, drug and alcohol addictions, and the consequences of those actions. As he said in I Me Mine, it's about what happens to naughty boys in the music business. If Simply Shady is the drama happening in real time, then the next song, So Sad, is the sobering aftermath. Played mainly on acoustic guitars, it's all about how painful splitting from Patty has been on Harrison and how lonely he is. This song is the inverse of Here Comes the Sun. From the winter has come to eclipse out the sun lyric to the weeping slide guitar riffs on each of the So Sad, So Bad lines. George was really going for broke in his emo phase. Vocally, this is one of the better tracks off the album, and you do really feel his anguish here. A humbling reminder that even though George considered relationships as all part of the material world, he couldn't escape the devastation of a broken marriage and the betrayal of a friend. To close out this triptych of misery, we have Bye Bye Love. Bye Bye Love. Why does this song sound like George on Helium? Bye Bye Happiness. A twist on the Everly Brothers hit that substitutes in Harrison's own lyrics of loss. There goes our lady with a you-know-who. I hope she's happy. This is a pretty pointless, but again insightful look into George spilling the tea on his own drama, but perhaps 2 songs was enough. It's just kind of bizarre to hear this much intimate information from someone who shunned gossip and craved privacy. Keeping up the soap opera analogy, this is the episode where George jumped the shark. Bye Bye Love also sounds pretty awful and lacks the quality control of his previous efforts, making it the clear weak spot on the album for me. Thankfully, things improve at the end of side 1 with the funky Maya Love. This is filled with groovy keyboard breaks from Billy Preston and contains some equally smooth guitar licks from George. Maya, roughly translating to illusion in Sanskrit, is what Harrison was struggling to grapple with most during this period, even going without regular meditation for a couple of years. The song doesn't really go anywhere, but musically, it's the most engaging cut on the album so far, and is a great example of George's affinity for R&B. Sounds like this one really popped off on the Dark Horse tour as well. Side 2 begins with George's only ever attempt at a holiday classic.
1, 2.
Ding Dong Ding Dong. To me, this is the soap opera's drunken New Year's scene where Harrison is partying away the sadness we experienced on side 1. The lyrics, ring out the old, ring in the new, shows Harrison's desire to move on from all that was troubling him and start fresh with an attitude of #New Year, New Me. Based on the fun music video, George's first ever as a solo artist, the old is his many Beatle identities, complete with stiff, disturbing smiles plus... Sorry, what was I saying? Oh yes, more symbolically, I think we can say that Ring Out the Old is Patty Boyd and Ring in the New is Olivia Arias, whom Harrison first met in 1974 and would later go on to be his wife. To further the metaphor, George even put an image of Olivia's eyes on the second side's face label. I like this track, it's got a massive arrangement and I feel like you get a real sense of the silliness and joy. Part early 60s Phil Spector Christmas recording, part 70s glam rock, and containing more lyrics from the various Frank Crisp carvings at Friar Park. Unfortunately, it was released quite late in the year and failed to make an impact as a holiday single. The other single from Dark Horse is the title track, which copped a top 20 spot in the US, but became Harrison's first single to fail to chart in the UK, marking Dark Horse as the period George's home turf began turning their back on him. More than perhaps any song on the album, Dark Horse shows the most visceral extent to how hoarse George's voice was on his US tour. Having only recorded the track in LA just a couple of days before the tour began. Many were insulted that he even released a single with his voice in the state that it was, but personally, I think it helps to tell the story of the album. Plus it gives him this Tom Waits-like gravitas. Or as Harrison said, I thought I sounded like Louis Armstrong. George meant Dark Horse in the Northern English sense of the phrase, of someone who carries out clandestine sexual relationships, which he emphasizes with the line, running on a dark race course. But it also carries the more traditional meaning of revealing himself as the unexpected victor in the early post-Beatles solo careers. The irony being that this was the album that shattered that position going forward. There's an early acoustic take that he recorded months before where his voice is in great shape. But to me, this is a pretty solid track regardless. Musically, it's just a very enjoyable tune. I like the flutes and smooth harmonies. Plus it contains some of the best lyrics on the album. The second to last track is also one of the best. Harrison's song co-written with Ronnie Wood, the soul-infused Far East Man. From the garbled opening where he dedicates the track to Frank Sinatra, and tells him to include this one at Caesar's Palace on his next live album. This song, to me, brings to mind the same party from Ding Dong Ding Dong, but hours later with Harrison leaning on a mic and singing with all his heart to a crowd of passed out partygoers. It's a more hopeful tune as Harrison muses on the emotional weight of what he's gone through that year and ultimately deciding that he's got to follow his heart and rise above the bullshit. I really enjoy this track. I dig the way it slowly builds to Harrison's wailing vocal at the end. Band members like Andy Newmark from Sly and the Family Stone and legendary session musician Willie Weeks on bass, this is another song, one of the first ones, that captures Harrison's burgeoning talent for soul music. One of Harrison's better experiences of 1974 was his long-awaited return to India, where he had his, quote, most fantastic experience, which involved him travelling with Ravi Shankar to the Hindu holy city of Vrindavan, where Harrison rediscovered his faith and took part in chanting Vedic hymns for hours, which, quote, melted all the bullshit away. Turn this blissful chanting into the closing song, It Is He, Jai Shri Krishna, and it might actually be my favourite track on the album. I know it's kind of absurd, like the Moog, the wobble board. Why do I like this song? I think it's the chanting. It translates to praising Lord Krishna and Goddess Radha, and I don't know, there's just this ludicrous ecstasy on here that I really feel. Like George bottled that bliss and turned it into an insanely catchy earworm that every time I hear it, I just... George's voice also sounds great. The flutes, a musical reference to Krishna, are really soft and lovely. This blending of world instruments allowed for a new musical category which some christened Country and Eastern or Krishna Skiffle. You know, it's a very George thing to have an album of such drama and despair and then cap it off with a jaunty song that refuses to take itself seriously. It's kind of nice that he opens and closes this LP with a bit of joy. The feel-good closing credits to a very dramatic season of the George Harrison whirlwind soap opera. It was the last overtly devotional song released for many, many years. And look, I know they were contentious with the critics, but I really love these kind of songs. Like, if you've never heard this track before, I guarantee you haven't heard anything else like it. It caps off an album that is by no means Harrison's best, but I think it's one of his most intriguing records. Many songs heard in a vacuum may not hold up as anything spectacular, but it's the context from which they were created that makes Dark Horse such a ride. I believe that the urgency of getting the album done helped to uncensor Harrison to write songs about things that were truly afflicting him at the time. And in that hasty, emotional frame of mind, George Harrison compiled something that has the energy akin to a post-punk album. It's emotional, a little bit weird, and brutally revealing. And that weirdness and stark honesty is why I prefer it over the guarded gloss of Cloud 9. Although it was lambasted by critics at the time, I think it's become only more compelling and fascinating as the decades have gone by. So I'm going to give it the tiniest bump up from Cloud 9 with a 7.1 out of 10. Jai Sri Krishna. Much like the previous 2 years, George Harrison was having a rough 1976.
Recently I've been more of a lawyer. I've been to court so much.
With 2 different lawsuits plus a near fatal case of hepatitis brought on by too much drinking. In spite of all this though, the year began to slowly improve and he managed to create one of his most upbeat and impressive albums of his whole career. It's the next on our list, 33 1/3. Named for the fact that Harrison was 33 1/3 himself when recording the album, as well as the speed at which a vinyl LP plays on a turntable, this is such a welcome return of some of Harrison's sunniest pop songs, and it couldn't have come at a better time for George. 1976 was a turning point in his life where his circle of friends shifted from the seedy remnants of the LA music scene to people like Eric Idle and the Monty Python crew. He appeared on Rutland Weekend Television, where he debuted the Pirate song, co-written with Idle.
I like to be a pirate's life for me. All my friends are pirates and they sing the BBC. I got a Jolly Roger, it's a black and white and fast. So get out of your skull and crossbones and I'll run it off your man.
And joined them for a performance of the Lumberjack song on Broadway, dressed as a Mountie. George was also doing unprecedented levels of promotion for the album, with plenty of interviews and music videos, a total first for him. He was even a guest on the relatively new show Saturday Night Live, where he not only showed off his deadpan comedic chops,
Live from New York, it's Saturday night.
but he also played a legendary duet with Paul Simon, performing a breathtaking rendition of Homeward Bound and Here Comes the Sun.
And each town looks the same to me, the movies and the factories, and every stranger's face I see reminds me that I long to be homeward bound.
Seriously, one of the best things on YouTube. He was clean-shaven, appearing healthier, plus he was often wearing that cozy cardigan, so he was always looking cuddly and sweet. And he was back recording in his home studio, assisted by the tightest group of musicians yet. Billy Preston and Richard T on keys, Willie Weeks on bass, and Alvin Taylor on drums, to name a few. Plus, after producing by himself on his last few albums, Harrison had the good sense to enlist saxophonist Tom Scott with production assistance, which really made a world of difference as this record sounds wonderful. It shimmers and shines with open clarity, particularly when compared to the murky extra texture from the year before. Right from the jump, you can tell this is a renewed George Harrison. The first 10 seconds of the opener, Woman Don't You Cry For Me, are better than anything from the entirety of extra texture. Rumbly slap bass, stabbing clavinet, and Harrison's trademark slide guitar, this is another fantastic album opener. Written back in 1969 and almost included on his debut post-Beatle album, it's actually the first song where George Harrison experimented on slide guitar after Delaney Bramlett handed him a bottleneck slide, and Harrison's iconic sound was born. You can actually hear it as an acoustic demo on the 50th anniversary deluxe set of All Things Must Pass. And going from that, it's just really wonderful to hear how his technique and musical stylings evolved over the course of 6 years, where it became a stellar blues funk return to form on 33 1/3.
Gonna leave you here. I'm gonna leave you in the station.
The previous few years showed a faltering in Harrison's commitment to his Hindu faith, as is evident on Extra Texture, where for once there were no overt theological statements or mentions of Krishna. This was also because Harrison had learned that if he harped on too much about such philosophies, they would be panned by critics who were still fairly sour on him. But on 33 1/3, Harrison learned how to incorporate Indian theology in a subtler fashion, where he would shift the focus of the songs to elicit the feelings and the spirit of the teachings instead of what many critics unfairly deemed as lecturing and preaching of these practices. George showcases this talent on the gorgeous song Dear One. It's a song dedicated to Paramahansa Yogananda, who wrote the 1946 book Autobiography of a Yogi, which Harrison said had a, quote, great deal of influence on my life. Harrison's only song ever written in open A tuning. It's a blissful mix of synthesizers and harmonies, and I just love the way George's voice bends around the notes in the song's first section. This is one of the prominent examples of George singing as well as playing in a style clearly inspired by Indian music. The chorus switches to a big pop production akin to something off Abbey Road,
My spirit sings to you now.
giving this song a lot of Beatles colour. Great track. The maturity of George's spiritual compositions is explored further on the synth-heavy See Yourself. This is actually a song written all the way back in 1967 after Paul McCartney controversially answered honestly about his taking LSD when the question came up in a televised interview.
4 times. But you're asking me the question. You want me to be honest. I'll be honest, you know.
I said, but if you've got any worries about this having an effect on kids, then you don't show it.
Decades later, Harrison said,
It just seemed strange to me because we'd been trying to get him to take it for about 18 months. And then it just seemed funny that one day he's on the television talking all about it.
Nonetheless, this song is a defense of Paul's decision, as George sings that it's easier to criticize somebody else than to see yourself. A song built around a series of synths, it's a credit to Harrison that during this period where synths were all the rage and guitar music was apparently dead, he managed to utilize them seamlessly into his music whilst retaining his unique guitar flourishes. Yet another composition from the late 60s is finally realized with the charming Beautiful Girl. Some have pointed out that this song sounds like it could have come from Rubber Soul, and I quite agree. It's a lovely guitar ballad with gorgeous twin guitar solos that run counter to the melody, another great use of Harrison's songs within the song technique. originally written about Pattie Boyd, but never completed until he fell in love with Olivia Arias. George didn't write that many overt boy falls in love with girl numbers, so you sort of have to cherish tracks like this because it really is one of his sweetest love songs. The album contains a few of these, as a matter of fact. You've got yet another cover of an American classic with the buoyant True Love, originally by Cole Porter. It's a massive improvement from the vindictive take on Bye Bye Love from Dark Horse. He's crooning all over this one. He's George Crooney. Oh my god, I'm sorry, please keep watching. And also features this hilarious music video. The Burt Bacharach-like Learning How to Love You closes the album. This one took me a while to really appreciate because it can seem like a fairly drowsy end to what is an upbeat album, but there's a lot of beauty in this love ballad. From the sophisticated arrangement by Tom Scott to the exemplary guitar solo from Harrison. It's like a smooth jazz version of his Beatle hit, Something. Harrison's singles were also top-notch, beginning with the track This Song. One of the lawsuits I mentioned moments ago was Bright Tunes suing George Harrison for the accidental musical plagiarism in his song My Sweet Lord, which has melodic similarities to He's So Fine by the Chiffons. This was a lengthy and costly battle for Harrison that he ultimately ended up losing, but Harrison took this controversy that was a scourge on his soul for years and turned it into a sunny and catchy pop song. I mean, that really speaks to who George Harrison was, I think. Harrison said that he wrote it to, quote, exercise the paranoia about songwriting that the episode had fostered in him. It's a great tune, lots of puns and tongue-in-cheek humour regarding his copyright case. It features a playful cameo from Eric Idle suggesting it does in fact sound like other songs. Unlike His Name Is Legs, this humour actually translates. It's self-aware commentary that pokes fun of music plagiarism with an upbeat funk groove. It's like proto-Weird Al. The music video also shows that he has a sweater-vest version of that same cardigan print. Incredible. The other single, Crackerbox Palace, is another cheerful track. It's got some of that classic Beatles cartoonish whimsy to it, kind of like Savoy Truffle, and features yet another excellent and zany music video from Harrison that gives us a tour of his own Crackerbox Palace, Friar Park. The track It's What You Value has a similar vibe to it to this song, but at a slower tempo. It features a marimba in the chorus, which I really like. It's catchy and it's got a great funk sound. George Harrison and John Lennon both have these songs that sound like they're the opening credits of Saturday Night Live. Which makes sense because this album features musicians almost entirely from that New York studio scene of the 70s. George's release before this was Extra Texture, which was his soul album, and a genre he'd been experimenting with since Far East Man off of Dark Horse. But it's not until his second and vastly superior tribute to Smokey Robinson on 33 1/3 that he really masters the genre. This is an elegant and warm dedication to one of Harrison's music idols, featuring a rare non-slide guitar solo that recalls Carl Perkins. By 1976, Harrison was more or less a has-been in the UK due to the emergence of punk shifting people away from his funky and playful American vibe. But George knew this and played to his strengths, making an album that featured soul, synth-pop, southern rock, and funk sounds that were still a la mode in the United States. And what a relief 33 1/3 was for George Harrison fans. After two disappointing albums, it wasn't clear if he'd ever return to his early 70s power. Thankfully, George put his naughty years behind him and focused on making a confident album that may have been light on heady spiritual musings, but featured first-class songwriting and superb production. He kept his usual inner turmoil at bay and reconnected with his pop sensibilities whilst maintaining musical complexity and expertise. As he said on Countdown in 1977,
but I think generally the album's nice because it's happy. Like, we go through so many crazy things in our lives, and I've been up and down, and the music always reflects it. I think my last album was more down, and this one is just happy and up. That's what I like about it.
Me too. 7 1/3 out of 10. After George's 1987 record, Cloud 9, he was reminded of the joys of making music with friends, and got together with the likes of Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, and Roy Orbison to record not just one, but two albums as the tongue-in-cheek band Traveling Wilburys. I'll talk more about this supergroup and their albums after the main list, but suffice it to say, George Harrison was having fun making music again, which eventually buoyed him into his first tour in 17 years. Taking place entirely in Japan,
Hi, Tamori. Hi, Tamari.
Nice to be here.
Hello.
George played a limited run of 12 shows to well-behaved crowds, which wrapped up at the end of 1991. They even made a live album out of the tour, which again I will be discussing after the core list of studio albums. George also played a one-off show at the Royal Albert Hall in 1992, marking his first time playing live in London since 1969. It was a benefit for the Natural Law Party, a political group founded on the principles of George's beloved transcendental meditation. This was to be his final full-length concert of his life. From there, George was pulled back into the world of the Fab Four as the multi-year preparations for the Beatles anthology were underway. Anthology was a huge undertaking, and aside from everything else, it introduced us to George's love of the ukulele, an instrument he'd become partial to in the 80s and 90s, so much so that his son, Danny, recalls that George was rarely without one in hand.
That's really what he was like around the house all day, just playing ukulele, and he'd sing everything on the uke.
The 90s were an otherwise quiet time for George, who could be found relaxing with his main hobby, gardening, and occasionally taking up residence in Hawaii.
Hello, Homer. I'm George Harrison.
Oh my God. Oh my God! Where did you get that brownie?
Over there, there's a big pile of them.
Oh man.
Wow, what a nice fella.
There were two key events
Oh my God.
in Hawaii.
Hello, Homer. I'm George Harrison.
Oh my God. Oh my God! Where did you get that brownie?
Over there, there's a big pile of them.
Oh man.
Wow, what a nice fella.
There were two key events that happened to George in the second half of the decade. The first was being diagnosed with lung cancer and being told he had 6 months to live, but battled on far longer than doctors predicted. The second event occurred in December 1999, when a disturbed intruder broke into Friar Park and stabbed George multiple times, before Olivia and George apprehended him.
And didn't let it affect him. But it definitely took years off his life, you know? So if you're trying to fight cancer and then you're trying to stay alive for something like that, you know, it's got to take it out of you, you know?
This attack, combined with the fact that George's cancer had metastasized to his brain, meant that he knew for certain death was looming. So he phoned his old buddy Jeff Lynne and enlisted the help of his now adult son Danny to record his final album of songs that he had been working on throughout the 90s and beyond. After a few working titles such as Portrait of a Legend and Your Planet is Doomed Volume 1, George landed on the title Brainwashed. George Harrison was in the unique position where, unlike John Lennon and so far, thankfully, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, he knew that this would be the last album of his career and life. He tragically died before it was finished, but he left a roadmap for Jeff Lynne and Danny to complete it, which they did in late 2002, 1 year on from his death. It also created the longest gap between George Harrison's studio albums, 15 years. The album, which was recorded reel-to-reel on analog tape, was mostly completed with essentially all backing tracks done.
It was almost as if my dad had the whole thing mapped out and we were just these lab rats trying to find our way through the maze that hadn't quite been finished yet.
George even recorded himself humming the string parts that would be on one of the tracks. And what George decided to leave us with is an album recorded simply with bare bones production and mostly acoustic instruments, but with unparalleled depth and emotional resonance.
It's not high tech, and it's not a rap or techno or whatever version of it.
It opens with George asking,
"Give me plenty of that guitar."
And sure enough, the jangly sounds of acoustic guitars oblige on the track Any Road. Strumming alongside it is a banjo-ukulele hybrid called a banjolele, which springs into gear as George takes us on a road trip of his own life and philosophy. This is a song George had been toying with since the late 1980s, which is why it has a distinct Wilbury flavour to it. He actually debuted it in 1997 on VH1 during his final TV interview.
I've been traveling on a boat and a plane and a car and a bike and a bus and a train.
It chugs along happily and sets the perfect tone for the album. The production is noticeably scaled down from Cloud 9, and as a result, George's voice sits at the forefront as he sings,
If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
Yeah, there's no reverb or glossy effects anywhere on this album. This grants listeners access to what George always wanted in his songs, the pure emotion above all else. Back in 1970, George released a song called Waiting on You All that ruffled some clerical collars by cheekily claiming that the Pope owns 51% of General Motors. The specific claim was false and of course a joke, but it served to highlight the corrupt and hypocritical business of the Catholic Church. 30 years later on Brainwashed, George's song P2 Vatican Blues, Last Saturday Night, goes after the same institution and how the truth is hiding, lurking, banking, things they do at night. This good old-fashioned 12 Malabar Blues track demonstrates George Harrison's Beatle-era sense of humour. And that his assessment of organised religion is as biting as ever. One of my favourite elements of Brainwashed is the incredibly personal insight into George Harrison's psyche. He has multiple songs on here that serve as striking confessional statements. 3 of them in particular are sequenced together. The first is the song Pisces Fish. This is a lovely tune about the duality, the contradiction, the paradox of George Harrison. It also happens to be his star sign, and in the world of astrology, Pisces are known for being emotionally fluid, vacillating between feelings, and being very in tune with their emotions and those of others. They also have contradictory natures, which is what George explores here. Guided by his water sign, the song contains real imagery of rowers on a river, as well as the river that runs through his soul, and seeking to swim unbounded in an ocean of bliss. The music is delightful as it laps around the listener's ears, but the lyrics are some of my favourite in all of George Harrison's discography. From George looking once again to silence for the answer, to the words that sum up the song and the man himself. Sometimes my life it seems like fiction. Some of the days it's really quite serene. I'm living proof of all life's contradictions. One half's going where the other half's just been. Many songs are modelled off Bob Dylan's musical stylings, and Pisces Fish takes this model to new heights. I also love the way that he says beer in this song. Innovative beer. Innovative beer. I love that. The second song relating to the nature of George's existence is Looking for My Life. George was a complex person but contained straightforward values. And here he's letting us in on the overwhelming feeling of entering the daunting 21st century.
Nobody seems to listen to anything anyway these days, do they? All got cloth ears. Especially me.
Things these days are not so simple, and he's insecure about keeping up, even lamenting that he never got any GCEs. Primarily made up of strummed acoustic guitars, this is a humbling song that progresses pleasantly as George continues to search for meaning in his ever-changing life. We then have the third song covering the inside of Harrison's mind, Rising Sun. The verses in minor key explore his experience on the avenue of sinners and being taken for a ride on the street of villains with the devil as a guide. But then the chorus hits and we ascend to a higher plane of hope and tranquility as George, now in major key, reassures the listener that you can feel your life begin in the here and now. The rising sun is inside of you, the universe at play inside your DNA. You're 1 billion years old today. George demonstrates more beguiling yet restrained slide guitar that warms and calms you like a brilliant sunrise. The song reminds me of a story Olivia Harrison tells about George when she recalls him looking at this beautiful sunset.
There was this amazing sunset, just orange sky, and he said, that is what I want to do. He wanted to be able to create that sunset.
But George's true guitar genius appears on the next track, a rare but important instrumental, Marwa Blues. Named after Raga Marwa, George's favourite Indian classical raga traditionally played at sunset, Marwa Blues is one of the most significant pieces of music George Harrison ever created. Ever since his solo trip to India in 1966, where he discovered his love for Indian ragas, George devoted his life to creating music that blended the Indian aspiration of spiritual connection with the Western instrumental form, primarily through the inflections of his own slide guitar. And since George has repeatedly said, both in songs and in life, that words and lyrics often do not do justice to this pursuit, how perfect then that he should ultimately reach this divine union by letting his music speak for him. The harmonic shape of the piece rolls back and forth like waves gently lapping on a beach, as blissful percussion, elegant strings, and ethereal keyboards support George Harrison's graceful slide guitar, the sparkling tone of his 6-stringed instrument resonating like the call from beyond. Marwa Blues is perhaps the greatest guitar piece he ever recorded. In classic Harrison fashion, it's not flashy or complicated, but impossibly moving and celestial. It's one of Paul McCartney's all-time favourite compositions, and also posthumously earned George Best Pop Instrumental Performance at the 2004 Grammys. Danny Harrison has mentioned that George's favourite number was 7, and so when Danny was sequencing the tracks, he placed his favourite of the songs, Stuck Inside a Cloud, in the number 7 spot.
And that was the highest honour I could have given a track on the album, was to put it track 7. That is my favourite. that track. I love it.
This is a chilled out song featuring a rather anxious George Harrison. The lyrics exhibit a man sleeping very little, crying out loud, and losing his will to eat. I first thought that this was a song about his battles with cancer before I learned that it was written years before his diagnosis. This deceptively upbeat song is one of turmoil for Harrison. What exactly he's burdened with is unclear, but I can't help but feel deep sympathy for his struggle. On the track Run So Far, George employs the Hawaiian slack key guitar technique, something he no doubt mastered living out his days in Maui, and it makes for an inviting listen. This was a song written by Harrison and originally recorded by Eric Clapton in 1989. I much prefer Harrison's version. With his appealing harmonies and smooth rhythm, it creates a relaxing and tranquil state of mind. The calming mood continues on Never Get Over You, a leisurely but touching song to Olivia. It features chord changes that progress one half step at a time, something Harrison's employed before in previous songs, but the tension this progression creates is countered by touching lyrics and Harrison's smooth and expressive voice. I mentioned previously that Harrison formed a love for the ukulele back in the late 80s, which is showcased marvelously on the LP's one cover song, Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. This track is actually remixed from a 1991 television appearance for Jules Holland, where George merrily plays with a bunch of mates to this delightful 1930s number made famous by Cab Calloway, a favourite of Harrison's. There's not much else to say here other than the charm is positively spilling out of this track. George and the ukulele go so well together, it's criminal that this is his only album that features the instrument prominently, especially considering how much he loved it. The genesis of the penultimate track, Rocking Chair in Hawaii, goes all the way back to 1970 during the All Things Must Pass sessions. Here, George was channeling his pre-Perkins guitar heroes Jimmy Rogers and Hank Williams. Based off Williams' Long Gone Lonesome Blues, she's long gone. George can be heard yodeling all the way through this early country demo. Then, at the end of his career, he resurrected this country mood by giving it a smooth South Sea update. The undulating groove of this song, paired with the genuine seductiveness of George's voice and suggestive lyrics, I'm going down to the river, makes this one of the most sultry tracks of his career. I really didn't expect the second last song on George's final album to be this sexy. I love those sideways glances, your shoulder and your thigh. What underlines the creation of this album is that George Harrison knew he was going to die. He knew he was about to leave his body, and so wrote and recorded one last song for us all to grapple with. And that song is Brainwashed. In this final number, George runs through a litany of institutions that he believes have brainwashed us.
Brainwashed in our childhood, brainwashed by the school, brainwashed.
From the rules of our teachers and schools, to the press, leaders, kings, queens, the Dow Jones, the media, the military. And from these problems, he provides the ultimate answer. God, God, God. George wasn't mincing words. He was really like, hey, so here's everything wrong with the world. It's all kind of fucked up, but I've been telling you from the start of my solo career what the solution is. Maybe you'll finally listen this time. This is one of the ballsiest ways to close an album you know is going to be your last. Hearing George Harrison sing Brainwashed by Mobile Phones almost doesn't sound right, like it's that prophetic. Like, of course we know we're brainwashed by our phones, but back in 2001, this is what mobile phones looked like. It was like the man had a glimpse of the 21st century and was like, no thanks, that'll be all for me. It's all delivered with a defiant rock attitude which eventually breaks into a calm interlude of Indian instruments, backing a reading from Patanjali's How to Know God. The soul does not love, it is love itself. It does not exist, it is existence itself. It does not know, it is knowledge itself. How to Know God, page 130. This brief guide pointing people in the God-conscious direction makes way for more recitations against the brainwashers, each delivered more fervently than the last. No longer was George merely accepting tolerance with a that's the way it goes attitude. This return to defiant protest song borrows from the anger of the late 60s, which after 30 years was starting to feel appropriate again. This album was released in 2002, but it didn't catch on properly until 2003, right as a new anti-war sentiment was rising up from a post-9/11 society. This message George sent us from beyond was more relevant than ever. Just before the core song comes to an end, an embattled George cries out, I just won't accept defeat, as we wind down to a single harmonium drone. which, in Simon Lang's words, represent the unchanging, eternal nature of the soul. Then the two voices of George and Danny Harrison break into the traditional Sanskrit prayer, Nama Parvati.
Nama Parvati Pataye Hara Hara.
A father and son singing in unison with only the occasional tabla. Indian philosophy teaches that religious chants are the roots of all music, and here George honours this notion with dignity and reverence. I will never forget listening to this part of the song for the first time. I didn't know it was coming, and it just completely stopped me in my tracks. I just found it to be so powerful. Every time I hear it, it's so deeply moving. George was able to finally, without the pretense of commercial pop, perform his devotional song, his bhajan. It translates to surrender to Shiva, Parvati's Lord. Shiva is the destroyer of ignorance, the great Lord, the eternal Lord. These two core parts of the song underline the musical and spiritual vision of George Harrison himself, a reluctant rock star with an incisive point of view, but whose ultimate goal was to live a quiet, devoted existence. The ending to Brainwashed is a remarkably fitting conclusion to George Harrison's musical career. It is the only album written and recorded beyond the course of a decade, beginning in the late 80s all the way to the early 2000s, making it a musical odyssey of the final chapter of Harrison's life. You know, David Bowie's final album, released 2 days before his death, Black Star, is highly revered in music circles, as it should be. But I believe that George's swan song strikes a similarly profound note. No, it's not as innovative as Bowie's music, but because Harrison was never concerned with sounding contemporary, this album, free of any production dressing, has a remarkable, timeless quality to it. Musically, it may appear rather simple, but listening deeper, Brainwashed is an elegant, candid, and profoundly reflective record. A parting gift from a wonderful soul. 7.5 out of 10. Oh, just gonna get my jacket back on. Whew, alrighty. It's hard to believe that just 2.5 years was considered a significant break between albums. But for George Harrison, who had released an LP every year of the 70s except for 71, taking a year off was a rare and much deserved novelty. After the groovy and cosmopolitan 33 1/3 in 1976, Harrison essentially took a gap year in 77 and embarked on a cross-continental trip with Olivia, attending the Formula One World Championship. It was a year when he revelled in his love for cars, bonded with some of the finest racers on the circuit like Jackie Stewart and Niki Lauda, and didn't write a single scrap of music. Oh, and he also got a fierce perm that's contentious amongst Harrison fans to this day. Maybe I should have got a perm for this video. I'm absolutely kidding, don't worry. Oh, it's starting to rain. Growing his friendship with the Python crew, he helped develop Eric Idle's Beatles parody film The Ruttles' All You Need Is Cash, which even features Harrison in a cameo role.
So, Stig injured by Big Valerie.
The film is hilarious and you can watch me talk about it here. George also started compiling his song manuscripts for what would turn into his autobiography, I Me Mine. This is like its 3rd or 4th edition now. They've added a lot of stuff into it. And as 1977 turned into 78, George and Olivia learned that they were going to be parents for the first time and went on vacation to Hawaii, where the refreshed Harrison entered a highly creative period as he began writing the songs that would appear on the next album on our list, the lush and lovely self-titled George Harrison. George's days of the Beatles, lawsuits, cocaine, alcohol, critical lambasting and divorces were finally over. The yin of extra texture flipped to the yang of a relaxed and genuinely happy George Harrison. And as he was someone whose music always reflected his emotional state, this album is George's most blissful and optimistic. Man, I love this record. There's a welcome return to themes of nature on here, which I love. George was taking magic mushrooms in Hawaii, which, are you kidding me? We get a return of George's psychedelic music? Amazing. Punk, disco, and heavy metal, 3 prevailing music categories in England at the time that didn't appeal at all to George Harrison, who would admit to having no clue what his audience expected of him, but I don't think he really cared. There's not even any rock and roll on this album. Instead, we get breezy, tropical-tinged soft rock, expertly co-produced by another former student of Ravi Shankar, Russ Titleman. This ain't no goofy-ass Gone Troppo. These sun-kissed songs have a lavish elegance that positively melts the stresses off your body. As usual, Harrison opens with one of the album's highlights, the infectiously catchy Love Comes to Everyone. Brand new sound of shimmery guitars fed through the Roland chorus effects pedal coats the listener's ears. This phasing effect gives the guitar a richer, thicker sound that can be heard all throughout this LP. It's also got probably my favourite bass line in any George Harrison song. So true, it can happen to you Yeah, Willie Weeks really popped off on that one. Similarly, as on his previous record, this album has no overt Krishna or God references, but George's spirituality is still vibrating all throughout.
It takes time to love, comes to it.
That mini Moog solo from Steve Winwood is just kick-ass. Sometimes you can get kind of intellectual about critiquing a song, but this track is just a vibe. The whole thing is so f***ing groovy. Underrated single from a heavily underrated album. Oh, it's really coming down out there. Things then simmer down for a discarded Beatles song circa the White Album, the track Not Guilty. You can hear how the song sounded on the 50th anniversary release of the Beatles' self-titled record when the Fab Four took 102 takes to nail it down. Back then, a less confident Harrison played a straight rock version with the boys. 10 years go by and a more self-assured Harrison gives this number a slinky jazz pop mood. The descending chords are a classic Harrison motif, and they cast a mysterious intrigue over the song. The lyrics speak to the drama at the time regarding the trip to India, the Maharishi, and the fledgling Apple Corps. Hope this rain provides like a nice lo-fi chill ambiance. Speaking of the Beatles, one of Harrison's most beloved hits, Here Comes the Sun, gets an unexpected sequel with, you guessed it, Here Comes the Moon. Unlike the Guitar Gently Weep sequel on Extra Texture, this is an excellent pairing with his Abbey Road hit. Is it better? No, but there aren't many songs in general that are better than Here Comes the Sun. Unlike that track, Here Comes the Moon isn't a metaphor for anything, but a literal tribute to what George calls the mother to the stars at night. This dreamy, ethereal atmosphere fades in to make way for an incredibly bright guitar tone and George's gorgeous harmonies. It goes back to the lush psychedelia of songs like Sun King from Abbey Road. It's even got the very Beatles-esque "Oh yes" in the chorus. This is one of the songs George came up with when tripping on magic mushrooms in Maui. He later told the story, the sun was setting over the ocean and it gets pretty stunning even when you're not on mushrooms. I was blissed out and then I turned round and saw a big full moon rising. I laughed and thought it was about time someone, and it may as well be me, gave the moon its due. Isn't that a great image? One of my favorite George Harrison stories. And yeah, really lovely track. The chimes that open and close the song are the icing on the lunar cake. The trippy psilocybin times continue on the track Soft-Hearted Hannah. This is a play-by-play of Harrison's magic mushroom trip in the isolated community of Hannah in Maui. The riff is inspired by an earlier Harrison track, Deep Blue. It's got this ooky kooky magical mystery tour vibe, but musically features an eccentric ragtime piano and dobro slide guitar. There's a real Disney villain song quality to the chorus.
Then somebody older here and asked, did I come far?
And the influence of Monty Python is evident in the quirky lyrics. Probably the strangest series of words in any of George's recordings. I love the trippy sound effects in the last minute of the song when the tape speeds up and slows down, altering the pitch. It's just cool. This is the kind of shit I didn't realize I was missing from George Harrison. George also copped his most successful single in years with the song Blow Away. This features another classic Harrison songwriting device of the changing weather reflecting his changing mood. The structure and feeling of the song though is pure McCartney.
All I got to do is to love you.
Paints a vivid picture and the chorus is filled with optimism. Musically, it's rather quaint, but the message resonates nicely with an album that is fueled with the same sunny outlook. The song came from a time when George had to fix a hole in his roof when it was raining really heavily, and it is literally raining right now, pretty hard, and he was in a foul mood, but then he realized that soon the clouds would part and he could be happy.
All I got to be is be happy.
And you know what? I love this for George. He'd spent so much of the mid-70s in a bit of a downward spiral, so see him choosing happiness is a welcome change. All I gotta do is to love you. All I gotta be is be happy. Blow away, blow away, blow away. Another single that didn't quite fare as well is Harrison's tribute to his Formula One buddies, Faster. It's a ballad about one of George's true passions that contributes to the many contradictions of a man who loved nature and was attracted to peace and quiet, but who also happened to be obsessed with race car driving. He sums it up nicely in I Me Mine, actually. He's a master of going faster. I know that racing is, to a lot of people, dopey, maybe from a spiritual point of view. Motor cars, polluters, killers, maimers, noisemakers. Good racing, though, involves heightened awareness for the competitors. Those drivers have to be so together in their concentration, and the handful of them who are the best have had some sort of expansion of their consciousness. I'll pop you up here. How's that look? There you go. This is George. And this is the angle George takes with Faster. Although the chorus is rather stirring and the lyrics in the verses tell a compelling fable of fame, friendship and danger, the main hook just isn't all that catchy, but there's still plenty of redeeming qualities that make Faster an enjoyable track for me. The album also features two of George Harrison's best love songs back to back. The first is Dark Sweet Lady, a Spanish Hawaiian-inspired dedication to his beautiful wife. George's love songs were always ambiguous as to whether they were about God or a woman, or sometimes both, but there's nothing vague here. This is George's song about being rescued by the lady who would remain with him until his death, Olivia.
My dark sweet lady.
And what a pretty song this is. This is such a pretty and alluring song from George Harrison, who also offers up a delightful and moving Spanish guitar solo. The production really shines on songs like this. Wonderful arrangement, beautiful instrumentation with the angelic harp and island percussion. It kind of sounds like the Disney song Kiss the Girl from The Little Mermaid.
Not a single word, go on and kiss the girl.
And in fact features the 7 notes that make up the melody from yet another Disney song, Beauty and the Beast.
Beauty and the Beast.
And this is years before the release of either film. George really in his Alan Menken era on this album. His other love song definitely feels like it leans more towards God, titled Your Love Is Forever. This was originally going to be an instrumental, but Harrison's co-producer convinced George to write some lyrics. Either way, this is a stunning composition. Paul McCartney is often the Beatle people point to as having a true gift for melody, and he does. But I think people overlook George Harrison's superb melodic ability as well. And nowhere is this more evident than on Your Love Is Forever. It opens with a radiant guitar passage wrapped in a gentle calm meshing Eastern and Western musical aesthetics. The lyrics convey imagery of summer and winter passing, but declaring that your love is forever. Sincere, tender, heavenly. Truly one of his greatest love songs. There's a warm tropical vibe to this whole album, conveyed most vividly on the song Soft Touch, opening with that bedroom pop guitar sound and featuring a riff lifted straight from the horn line from his 1970 song Run of the Mill. Here, Harrison sought to convey the atmosphere around him. The wind, the cool breeze blowing, the palm trees, the new moon rising. Oh, and the lyrics, this is really cute. The lyrics taken from the LP show S-O-N, sun, instead of S-U-N, sun. Which I think is a lovely and touching tribute to his only child in what is another charming soft rock number. See, as a warm sun rises. Gorgeous, George. As a way to prepare for this new album, George re-listened to his post-Beatles debut, All Things Must Pass, and you can really hear the influence on the buoyant album closer, If You Believe. The slide guitar riffs, horns, and orchestral strings really bring to mind that 60s Phil Spector sound on this catchy track co-written by the Dreamweaver himself, Gary Wright.
I can feel like I'm about.
Just a little trick we learned from the ink spots.
This is one of George's most upbeat songs on his most upbeat album. I just love that this record is bookended with songs that send the message that if you love and if you believe, you'll get love in return. Like it's all the same karmic stuff George used to sing about, but with a more welcoming approach, a softer touch, if you will. You just finished this album with a big smile on your face, and I love that. By the end of the 70s, George's interest in music had waned significantly, and many thought he had lost his edge. But this only allowed George to take more time away from the business and discover new themes like family and domestic bliss, which Paul McCartney had exhibited in his early 70s output, and John Lennon was about to explore on his Double Fantasy album in 1980. This theme carried with it music that was more gentle and melodic, with lyrics focusing on love and nature, which also makes George Harrison one of his most Beatles-esque albums. Although this kind of softer music is often deemed lightweight, it's important to remember that in 1978, George was going through a lot of emotional changes, with his father dying, his son Danny being born, and getting married again. I believe George was seeing God in a lot of new elements of his life, making this album that much richer and full of heart. He was a renewed man and said as much at the time. I think what happened between this album and the last album is that everything has been happening nice for me. My life is getting better all the time and I'm happy. And I think that it's reflected in the music. The yin-yang cycle continued, however, as his next album was the bitter Somewhere in England. George also didn't do that much to promote this record, so it kind of came and went without much fanfare, but for me, this is a joyful, breezy, and deeply romantic album that sees George Harrison close out the 1970s on a high. It's probably not for everyone, but if you like your music lush and cheerful, perhaps you're a Japanese city pop fan, or if you're just looking to hear an updated Beatles throwback, then do yourself a favor and listen to this warm slice of tropical soft rock from the permed prince of melody himself. 8 out of 10. Having just come off the world's first charity benefit gig, the Concert for Bangladesh, which while hugely successful, left Harrison drained from the stresses of making sure the humanitarian aid got to those who actually needed it, instead of to businessmen like Alan Klein, who George was quickly tiring of. Once the live album was eventually released the next year in 1972, George took a solo driving trip across Europe where at one point, according to the man himself, he chanted the Hare Krishna mantra non-stop for the entire day. This trip reinforced his dedication to Hindu spirituality and set him on a path to make his second solo album, and one that lands at the number 2 spot on this list, the heavily anticipated Living in the Material World. George Harrison was on a roll. Not only had his debut post-Beatles album been a hit with critics, it also went to number 1 around the world. Boldly, Harrison decided to not use any leftover material from that crop of songs, of which there were many, and instead the songs on Material World are from 1971 and 72 only. These compositions go even further in declaring Harrison's spiritual devotion than on his previous effort. Instead of the jubilant chanting of the names of the Lord, on this album, Harrison takes on a more slightly condemning, solemn approach, with the song's lyrical content all about eschewing material possessions and temptations, trying to love the Lord more, karma, and the banality of court proceedings. This slightly more cynical mood reflects what was going on for Harrison at the time. Not only was he dealing with the disappointing distribution process for the Concert for Bangladesh, his failing marriage to Pattie Boyd was also tumbling towards its messy conclusion. Additionally, he was meant to be teaming up with Phil Spector again to produce the album, but had to go it alone due to Spector's erratic and unreliable behaviour. On top of all that, he was a man who was desperately trying to rid himself of excess and ego in order to live a more devoted life, but it just so happened to be the same man who released the most successful and acclaimed album of 1970 into 71, and then became a worldwide hero for his humanitarian efforts. George Harrison was nothing if not a man of contradictions, a Pisces fish, and this album explores these contradictions with fascinating depth and honesty. The commitment to his faith also found Harrison in his most disciplined physical peak of his life, having given up smoking for a time, which is evident on this record and showcases the best singing on any George Harrison album, in my opinion. One of the clearest examples of this is on the song The Lord Loves the One Who Loves the Lord. His voice is strong and in control, singing defiantly about the foolish desire of manifesting the Lord through one's own ego. Seeking fame and fortune when it doesn't matter because death will take it all away in the end. It's a big rock number, one of the only pure rock songs on an album heavy with ballads. The use of horns are a window into how George will use them throughout the 70s, and it provides a great taste of his direction into funk and soul. The influence for this track goes to Swami Prabhupada, the founder of the Hare Krishna movement, and the person who taught George that we are not these bodies, an oft-repeated philosophy of Harrison's and one that is explored on the next track. The song Living in the Material World explores George's frustrations at being stuck in this body in the physical world. Musically, the song's rhythm bears a slower similarity to Get Back, and also references the Beatles all by name with the humorous lyrics. Met them all here in the material world. And then throws in one of his best plays on words with, though he started out quite poor with... There's also 2 Indian music middle eights, which are really lovely. Our first slice of completely Indian music since Within You Without You and the Wonderwall soundtrack. It's also a rare occurrence of George Harrison on the sitar. These tranquil moments of Indian music to me symbolize the spiritual sky, the celestial realm that Harrison so desperately longs for. And then we crash back down into the loud rock verses referencing the physical material world. The Beatles continued to get a look in on this album with the only clearly secular song, Sue Me, Sue You Blues, about the headache-inducing legal battles Harrison experienced in the early 70s. Perhaps the repetitive, square dance-like do-si-do verses are a reflection of how childish and ever-changing George found these endless court proceedings. The dobro slide guitar sound is similar to that of Lennon's How Do You Sleep, which Harrison also played on. Fits appropriately as they're two songs that dredge up the bitterness between ex-Beatle bandmates, namely Paul McCartney, but also the man he warned them against, Alan Klein. However, most of Harrison's frustrations seem to be aimed at lawyers and courtrooms rather than anyone specific. There's also some great drum fills from Jim Keltner. The only single from the record also happens to be one of its true highlights and the album opener, Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth. A natural progression from the vibes of his seismic debut album, the song is yet another fusion of the Western gospel sound and the Hindu bhajan, or devotional song, that Harrison previously employed on tracks like My Sweet Lord and What Is Life. It's incredibly sincere, a prayer flowing straight from Harrison's soul that is both jaunty yet serene, even containing a sustained om in the bridge. Immediately upon hearing the song, it's evident that Harrison's production sound is pared down compared to his previous solo effort, and it allows for a balance that is closer to George Martin's work on Beatle records, with an increased clarity on the acoustic guitars and more space in general for the other instruments to breathe. The guitar solo in this song has so much personality and spirit, it's easily one of my favorites. Give Me Love became Harrison's second US #1 after My Sweet Lord. In doing so, the song pushed Paul McCartney and Wings' My Love from the top of the Billboard 100, marking the only time in history where two former Beatles have held the top 2 chart positions in America. I believe Harrison could have kept his #1s going if he only released this next album highlight, Don't Let Me Wait Too Long, as a single. The track is ridiculously catchy and would have been a surefire hit. The chorus is dreamy and the production showcases everything George Harrison learned from Phil Spector on their last effort, particularly with that big reverb-soaked timpani. I especially love George's falsetto on the Why didn't they make this a single? The remaining songs on the album are all slower ballads that go deeper into Harrison's internal conflicts and philosophies. Unlike McCartney, who deliberately masked his more personal songs with cryptic imagery or a story of a made-up person, Harrison could only write songs about what affected him and couldn't hide or disguise his feelings in his music.
You see, I'd write what really happened, and I couldn't sort of make up something that is untrue, because somehow it just doesn't fit in with me, you know, it's like untrue. I can't even conceive of that.
He was completely upfront with his emotions, whether it be his dissatisfaction with the world, his relationship with God, or in this next song's case, the public's need for him to stay the same person they first fell in love with. This is the crux of the song, The Light That Has Lighted the World, which serves as a direct confession from George. Personally, I find this song very moving, with some of my favorite Harrison lyrics.
It's funny how people just won't accept change.
It's got some of my favorite slide guitar work from George, particularly in the closing bars. My favorite description of these 6-string sobs is from biographer Simon Lang, who wrote, "George finally made his guitar gently weep." If you're not sold on this song, listen to the acoustic demo from Early Takes Volume 1.
I'm grateful to anyone that is happy.
It's a lot more intimate, and without the lavish piano and guitar solo, we're left with George's naked confession of a pop star who just wants to move on. This same sentiment of a man traumatized by his years in the biggest bands in history continues on the next track, Who Can See It? Harrison believes he's paid his dues, he's towed the line, and now just wants to be his own man. This one was a bit of a grower for me. It's another one of those songs that has a slightly meandering, suspended chord progression made up of different time signature changes. But as the song slowly ascends, George's power in those big choruses that close this number are just superb. Really channeling Roy Orbison, and despite him not having as strong or as steady a voice as his fellow Wilbury, he really goes for broke, and it does make this one of the best vocal performances of Harrison's career. George knew, in the same way as his guitar, how to use his voice to serve the song. This was because, again, George valued the music above all else, and his voice was always used to great effect because of this. This kind of vocal bravado was quite rare in Harrison's discography. George was famously the quiet Beatle, perhaps not quiet, but soft-spoken and gentle, and I think he had a lot of power in that sense. This is perfectly illustrated in perhaps the most powerful of George's quieter, gentler songs, and for me, a real favourite of his compositions, Be Here Now. I was on a plane trip last year in January, a trip that days before I didn't even know that I would be on. It's kind of bizarre. Anyway, I put this album on my headphones and quickly fell asleep because I was exhausted, and I woke up to this golden light from the window as the sun was coming up, and that moment Be Here Now started, and I kind of just sat in a daze watching this beautiful sunrise and heard the song in a way that I'd never heard it before. I'd also started meditating about 5 months before this, and had also read the book Be Here Now by Ram Dass that the song was based off. So to hear George sweetly singing in my ear to remember to be here now was just so unexpectedly moving, and now the song makes me cry like pretty much every time I listen to it. It just has a strange, enchanting power that takes you to another dimension. The softly picked guitar strings, the flashes of twinkling piano that gently encourage you to exist in the moment. Of course, that dreamy sitar drone just makes this song magical. This is a magical song. The pared down beauty of Be Here Now is then suddenly replaced with the enormous wall of sound of the only true Spector-produced track on the album, Try Some Buy Some. A song originally written for Ronnie Spector's proposed comeback album, the same album that was going to feature You from Extra Texture. It's fine, but probably my least favourite track on the album. I just think the sheer amount of Spector luster somewhat intrudes on the grounded and gentle mood of the record. Like the mandolins and harp, for example, they're just too over the top. At the time of this album's release, a key criticism that George Harrison received was from his inferred spiritual elitism, particularly from tracks like The Day the World Gets Round. Written the day after the Bangladesh concert, it reflects the bittersweet feeling of pulling off something so successful that helped a lot of people, but frustration at having to do it in the first place. Why were pop stars responsible for this sort of action and not world leaders who have all the power and resources yet squander it on weapons and other objects that destroy mankind? Personally, I think someone who had shown such altruism had every right to be frustrated that this huge humanitarian effort was being taken apart in the boardroom, by people like Alan Klein no less. Also, as George wrote in I Me Mine, some people have thought that in certain songs like this one, I was giving them a telling off, or that I was implying that I was holier than thou. I do not exclude myself and write a lot of things in order to make myself remember. I think that's a key component to remember about Harrison's lyrics. He's preaching to himself more than anyone else. I mentioned earlier about George being the quiet Beatle, and the final song on the album, That Is All, to me is a mature reflection of this status. There's many songs in his career where George will admit to having words fail to explain what he's really trying to express.
The problem with talking is, like, the more you say, the more you bury yourself. It's very difficult to express what you feel in your heart.
In this closer, Harrison sings, "Times I find it hard to say with useless words getting in my way. Silence often says much more than trying to say what's been said before." This declaration is the evolution of his 1966 Revolver song, I Want to Tell You.
All those words, they seem to slip away.
As the guitarist continues to struggle with basic language as a way to communicate the scope of his feelings. I've really grown to like this track. I used to see it as rather turgid, but there's just something about those sweet falsetto notes that close out the song that really gets me.
That is
Again, love George's falsetto. How lyrically appropriate on an album that opens with the words "Give me love," closes with "That is all." Give me love, that is all. A pretty wonderful and succinct way to sum up George Harrison. Living in the material world is often not remembered or held in the same esteem as George's magnum opus, but this record is a true forgotten gem that also became his second US Billboard #1. By 1973, much of the Western world was embittered by events like the Vietnam War and the rise of Richard Nixon, and this despondency resulted in many letting go of the idealism of the 60s and instead turned inward, getting high-paying jobs and settling down as the me decade of the 1970s was born. But there was still at least one rock and roll star who carried the torch of peace and love and kept it aflame when most others had only material interests in sight. George Harrison, though quick to dismiss the Beatles, fought to preserve their greatest message through his unprecedented charity benefit concert and this revealing, spiritual, and totally sincere album that also happens to contain Harrison's best work as a guitarist and singer. He may never hit quite the same heights after this, but by 1973 there was no denying that George Harrison was an artistic visionary, capable of reaching a higher power through music of tremendous depth and breathtaking honesty. 8.5 out of 10. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were breaking down. John from the psychological excavation of his own mind through primal scream therapy, and Paul from losing his sacred status as a Beatle, resulting in the former songwriting duo suffering from their own individual identity crises. Both of their debut 1970 albums exhibit this loss in their own way, but while Lennon and McCartney were struggling to come to terms with their standing in the world, George Harrison was ascending. Having been shackled by a measly 2-song-per-album quota by his 2 older bandmates, who also showed little interest at his ever-growing catalogue of impressive original songs.
I feel now I can play things, I can learn things that will sound okay.
George Harrison was out of their shadow and finally free. The previous 4 years had seen Harrison go on a journey of personal and spiritual discovery that began with him picking up his first sitar, which led to his lessons and visits to India with Ravi Shankar, who taught George that in Hindu culture, music and religion are intrinsically intertwined, played for the sole purpose of connecting with God, something that forever changed Harrison's approach to music. Not only had he found salvation in Eastern philosophy, but after touring with the Beatles ended, George found that he had time to hang out with musicians that for once didn't disregard his growing talents as a songwriter, but instead nurtured and supported him. People like Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Robbie Robertson and the band, Billy Preston, Doris Troy, the last 2 of which both released albums produced by Harrison, who all in their own way influenced and evolved George's musical foundations, opening him up to sounds like blues, country, gospel, and soul. While all this was happening with George, much of the Western youth was also being turned on to spirituality and polytheism, becoming almost a craze among many young people across the world. And on top of all of this, George had just spent more than 10 years as the musical go-between of the most successful songwriting partnership in history. His Beatle years had given George a musical education unique only to him, so much so that by Abbey Road, his 2 songs were arguably the best on the whole album. All of this training saw the guitarist poised for a kind of greatness no other musician, or artist for that matter, had ever found themselves in before. George Harrison was peaking in an unprecedented way. All that was left to do was to make his great artistic statement, or in his words, just get his songs out there. The songs that form my #1 all-time favourite George Harrison album, All Things Must Pass. Part of what makes All Things Must Pass such a fascinating album is that it was born out of Harrison's desire to separate himself from his Beatles history. I mean, you only have to look at the album artwork to see that. But the irony here is that the themes of All Things Must Pass, spiritual salvation, relationship breakdowns, humanity, fame, life, death, and friendship, all stem from his experience as a Beatle. He was trying to escape from something he was still intrinsically wound up in. For an album that needed to appeal to God, Harrison acquired the liturgical wall of sound that only legendary producer Phil Spector could provide. Even though the 2 co-producers couldn't have been more different in temperament, stylistically they created music of the divine.
And I needed somebody to help me suddenly to be a solo artist with no producer, and no group. Yeah. So it's like, it's quite a big jump.
I went to George's Friar Park, which he had just purchased, and he said, I have a few ditties for you to hear. It was endless. He had literally hundreds of songs, and each one was better than the rest. He had all this emotion built up when it released to me.
And to help him bring out this cathedral-like sound was a stellar lineup of musicians, including Eric Clapton taking a good chunk of lead guitar duties, Klaas Voormann on bass, Ringo Starr and Alan White on drums, members of Delaney and Bonnie and Derek and the Dominos, as well as several others. But how does one open an album that contains a smorgasbord of musical categories, including hard rock, gospel, Krishna chanting, pop, southern blues rock, country, and folk? Something this majestic needs to go big out of the gate, right? Ultimately, Harrison decided to take a leaf out of the band's book by opening with the gentle and understated I'd Have You Anytime. From the very first line,
let me in here. I know I've been here.
Harrison is softly pleading with his audience to let him in. led his songs into the lives of millions of people who were at a loss after the Beatles' breakup and needed the balm of George Harrison's music. The lyrics are rooted in the union of Harrison and Bob Dylan, as they co-wrote this track when George was staying with the folk singer in December 1968. After an apparently uncomfortable first couple of days, they finally got their guitars out, and George came up with the opening lyrics as a way to literally communicate with Dylan, who found the words for the chorus while Harrison wrote the verses. The chord progression came from Dylan, who wanted to see the complex major seventh, diminished, and augmented chords that Harrison was known for. The end result is a mellow and sweet number that reflects a mature vulnerability from Harrison and Dylan, a wonderful choice to ease you into what will be a very rewarding listening experience. This understated opening soon makes way for one of George Harrison's most legendary songs, as powerful six-string strumming and glistening zithers transports you up to heaven, where George Harrison is there to debut what would soon become his trademark sound, the slide guitar. George's slide guitar vignettes are pivotal to the man forming his own identity. He didn't have the blues roots background that allowed players like Clapton and Hendrix to perform face-melting multi-minute solos. Because of this lack of virtuosic ability, Harrison was, up to this point, quite self-conscious as a guitar player.
Really? Just Eric is very good at that. You know, like improvising and keeping it going, which I'm not good at.
Certainly not helped by Paul McCartney's occasional micromanaging on George's guitar solos, or even just insisting that McCartney do them himself. But Harrison's slide guitar technique allowed him to generate the inflections of Indian instruments like the sarangi through the micro vibrations of the bottleneck slide. Using a rock instrument to create sounds inspired by Indian music is the perfect complement to My Sweet Lord. As previously mentioned, classical Indian music exists as a conduit to God, and here Harrison was combining the impassioned call and response vocals of gospel music via the framework of classic rock. Featuring the messages of Christian and Krishna faiths as the chanting flits between Hallelujah and Hare Krishna, George was showing us that it's not important what religious organization you're part of. Forming a relationship with God is all that matters. And anyone, regardless of their faith, can create that cosmic connection by chanting the phrase, My Sweet Lord. The song itself was inspired by the Edwin Hawkins singer's rendition of the 18th century Christian hymn, O Happy Day.
Oh, happy day, oh, happy day, oh, happy day.
My Sweet Lord is impeccably constructed, right down to the backing vocals, all done by Harrison.
Sweet Lord.
Or as is credited in the album, the George O'Hara Smith Singers. There's something gloriously uplifting about this song, like a chemical change occurs in the body when you listen to it. I feel like even if you've heard it many times before, at one point you'll listen to My Sweet Lord and think it's the greatest song of all time. That's the power it has. George received letters from former addicts his whole life thanking him for creating this song that saved them. It became the biggest selling single of 1971 in the UK and the first US #1 for any ex-Beatle. And yes, it was of course slightly tainted by the copyright claim that it stole elements of He's So Fine by the Chiffons.
He's so fine. Wish you were mine.
It was a heavily litigated battle that went on for years, with the verdict that Harrison subconsciously plagiarized some melodic elements. It's almost laughable today how after 70 years of pop music, how similar so many #1 songs are. Because not to sound like a boomer, but you can switch on the radio right now and there'll be a song playing that sounds at least like a dozen others. But even without the copyright controversy, My Sweet Lord is a soaring, majestic anthem, an epic prayer, and an immaculate slice of 70s pop. And remember, George Harrison took a risk making this his debut single as a solo artist, but after years in the shadows, the Quiet Beatle was finally being heard. Remember in Get Back, there was that quietly devastating scene where George temporarily quit the Beatles?
I think I'll be leaving the band now. When? Now. Get a place.
Well, that same night, he put all of his frustrations at not being listened to, not being taken seriously, into one of the early 70s best hard rock songs, Wah Wah. That opening riff is one of Harrison's greatest guitar licks. It's as vicious and biting as the lyrics of Harrison singing, "You don't see me crying, you don't hear me sighing," which now always makes me think of Paul McCartney. The rhythm of this song is also just insanely good, from the maracas, congas, and tambourine, to to Starr's drums and Borman's bass locking into each other, perfectly channeling George's frustrations and anger. Harrison's voice is glorious and severe, even in this uncharacteristically higher register. Though it is drowned out a bit by Spector's Everything Everywhere All at Once approach to the production. Eric Clapton's guitar is appropriately fed through a wah-wah pedal, and the frantic guitar solo in this song is like the brimming staccato sound of George's exasperation finally set free. Although wah-wah exhibits some bitterness towards George's former bandmates, the song is more a liberating celebration of his newfound solo identity. This is reinforced in 1971 when wah-wah became the first song George Harrison played live as a solo artist at the Concert for Bangladesh. If a 5.5-minute wall of sound rock number wasn't enough to convince you that this is an album of epic proportions, then the next song should leave no doubt in your mind. A piano and acoustic guitar gently open on a G chord as the 7-minute grandiose Isn't It a Pity begins. The B-side to My Sweet Lord, this Harris song that dates back to 1966, in fact it was reportedly first offered up on Revolver, is George's lament for humanity on a grand scale.
Isn't it a pity?
This version, like many songs on the album, was arranged by Harrison's friend John Barham, whom Harrison met back in 1966 as both men were students of Ravi Shankar. Despite it being an older composition, its lyrical content cohesively aligns with the themes of friendships breaking down and spiritual ties that bond humankind that is heard all over All Things Must Pass. The slow build from guitar and piano to the awakening strings and rising horns creates a reverent and beautiful atmosphere. It's George's very own Hey Jude, even reprising the na-na-na-nas from the McCartney song, but this time, George gets to keep his terrific guitar solos. Those slide guitar vignettes are the moments of flickering hope as they weave through the more pensive orchestra. The bittersweet mood, the swelling atmosphere, and the superb orchestral arrangement showcases the last vestiges of the Beatles in this magisterial, all-time great song from Harrison. So great, it's on the album twice, with version 2 a shorter reprise, sans orchestra, but with the addition of more electric guitar from Clapton. So we've just heard 3 achingly emotional songs. Spiritual exaltation on My Sweet Lord, anger and frustration on Wah Wah, and sumptuous melancholy tinged with hope on Isn't It a Pity. An absolutely insane run of songs that just keeps going as we arrive at pop soul euphoria on the up-tempo What Is Life. This track proves that George isn't just capable of sweeping hymns and intimate ballads, but that he can still write a jubilant pop song that's as catchy as any Beatles hit single. I feel like this is the song that every feel-good rom-com or family movie uses in their trailer. See also This Will Be by Natalie Cole. What's not to love about this track? The gorgeous George harmonies to that guitar lick that gets right in your body. It's an absolute stunner. We finally bring things down again on the folky If Not For You. This is actually a Bob Dylan song and it honestly feels like George is channeling him here. No, not in that way. They'd obviously spent a lot of time together and it appeared that there was an intuitive understanding between the two soft-spoken musicians. John Lennon had always been the one that fascinated Bob Dylan, but George Harrison had been Dylan's lifelong friend and equal. A wonderful bit of earnest folk pop that Harrison made his own by highlighting the delightful melody and bringing to life the romantic imagery with his slide guitar.
If not for you, winter would hold those springs.
This is the point where folk transforms into full country on Behind That Locked Door. That pedal steel from Pete Drake is just divine. Harrison later praised Drake's pedal steel playing as the, quote, bagpipes of country and western music. This song also contains some of my favourite lyrics from All Things Must Pass. It's so open, so vulnerable. On the opening number, I'd Have You Anytime, George was trying to get Dylan to let his guard down. But on Behind That Locked Door, he's asking Dylan to fully open up.
So let out your heart, please.
These two songs of reassurance and support offer a special and beautiful connection between George Harrison and Bob Dylan.
He was very unabashed and romantic about it in a sense. You know, I found that he was very, he had these love relationships with his friends. He loved them.
After this little break from the bombast of Phil Spector's overwhelming production, we return with full force on the explosive yet serene Let It Down. This is possibly the most wall of sound track on the whole album. A song filled with lust and desire. It's also the horniest song on All Things Must Pass. I mean, I see your eyes are busy kissing mine, let your hair hang all around me, let your love flow and astound me. The Weeknd ain't got nothing on these lyrics. Even though George was on an ongoing spiritual journey where desires of the ego and the heart were intrusions to the ascetic path he was on, the lustful urges that are packaged with being the biggest pop star on the planet soon caught up with him. His marriage to Pattie Boyd was slowly breaking down, and these type of affairs with other women were becoming more and more common. Let It Down is a superb track. The dramatic shift between the loud chorus and soft verses is an approach many indie bands would incorporate in their own music decades later. If Wah Wah was the explosive response to months of pent-up vexation at being sidelined by John and Paul, then Run of the Mill is the clear-headed and sincere statement from the heart to his two former bandmates. It's heartbreaking and poetic. Even George admitted that the song's lyrics read like a poem. On the surface, it's a song of disappointment and hurt, but listening a little deeper, it's George expressing his love towards his old band. Listening to this karmic song can itself be a cathartic or shattering experience. And like on the cinematic Wah Wah, the context of Get Back gives Run of the Mill so much more depth, having seen firsthand their relationship and how the four Beatles were becoming fundamentally incompatible beings. Even the title of the song can be seen as a possible description by McCartney or Lennon of Harrison's musical contributions. It's a beautiful and mature song that also happens to be one of Olivia Harrison's favourite tunes from a late husband. The reflective mood continues on the next track, Beware of Darkness. Musically, this song moves in a fascinating and winding direction with some of Harrison's most complex chord progressions on the whole album. This serpentine melody is without a doubt the result of George's increasing understanding of Indian harmonic sensibilities. I feel like a lot of his work on Extra Texture is going for similarly complex chord progressions, but they just don't work as successfully as on Beware of Darkness. The music and lyrics have a foreboding quality to them and present a similar warning as on Within You Without You of remaining cautious of the illusion or Maya in its many forms. Beware of Maya. From thoughts that linger to the corrupt intent of greedy leaders. And he's on the money. The lyrics are as poignant today as they were in 1970. In fact, at the Republican National Convention in 2016, when Ivanka Trump introduced her father on stage to Here Comes the Sun, George Harrison's estate blasted the unauthorized use of the song and tweeted, "If it had been Beware of Darkness, then we may have approved it." Before things get too dark and solemn, we hear a jangly guitar and harmonica zoom into the picture as Apple Scruffs begins. Bob Dylan's influence on All Things Must Pass continues with this delightful number which is played in the style of early Dylan with an acoustic guitar and harmonica leading the song. This is a charming ditty written for the dedicated fans of the Beatles before and after their breakup that hung around EMI studios and Apple offices who just wanted to see the musicians they loved so much.
So does why?
Just want to say that's why.
Before hearing this song, if you had asked me who was the Beatle most likely to write a tribute song to these girls, I wouldn't have guessed Moody George. But that's the thing about this man. Right when you think you've got him figured out, he goes and creates something like the wonderful Apple Scruffs. It's another of George's many contradictions. He was someone who was very wary of fan worship, and yet these girls meant a great deal to him. He would often ask after their families and even invited the Scruffs in to hear this recording after he'd completed it, which they returned in kind with a giant wreath of flowers. And although it's undoubtedly inspired by early Dylan, I also think that because of the playful falsetto harmonies in the chorus, Apple Scruffs is also a nod to the girl group stylings that attracted these fans in the first place. Seriously, this is some of George's best backup singing on any of his albums.
Apple Scruffs, Apple Scruffs.
Wendy Sutcliffe, a real-life Apple Scruff, said of Harrison's tribute, "It was like he had seen it all, understood how we felt, and most of all, knew that we weren't just sad, stupid girlies." I just wish George only knew how young fans 50 years later still resonate with this delightful song that even outdoes Paul McCartney's charm and whimsy. I had to make a coffee because I am getting exhausted. You know this video was 40 pages? 40 pages, 28,000 words, just a bit over that if you're wondering. This album has covered a lot of ground, but now it's time to cover the literal ground of George's eccentric neo-Gothic mansion, Friar Park, as we take a tour with the song The Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, Let It Roll, a whimsical and mysterious tune that serves as a tribute to the original owner of Friar Park and fellow gardener, Sir Frank Crisp. The reverb-soaked song can be likened to a cinematic journey through the grand house and grounds of the estate as we
Let it roll across the floor.
through the hall and out the door. We've heard lyrics from other songs that's come from wall engravings around Friar Park, but now we finally get a proper musical tour of the estate, one that perfectly fits the album artwork. A humorous yet gothic delight. After a lot of deep thoughts and rumination, we land back into pop ecstasy with another album highlight, Awaiting on You All. Oh man, this song is just euphoric jubilation and simply impossible to resist. It's another track where Harrison espouses his syncretistic view of faith, as he sings, It reinforces George's view that it's not religion he's espousing, but a direct relationship with God. The lyrics have a really nice flow to them, they're a lot of fun. I mean, he rhymes visas with Jesus, and it's just excellent. But it also contains a verse that EMI and Capitol Records continue to omit from the album's lyrics that highlight the materialism of the Catholic Church. It's helplessly catchy and perfectly highlights Phil Spector's monstrous wall of sound technique to great effect. Probably the best use of it on the entire LP. Those harmonized slide guitars that glide back and forth throughout that create a frolicking and playful energy, while the memorable bass line and infectious rhythm will have even the most staunch non-believer chanting the names of the Lord for all of its tight 2 minutes and 48 seconds. After the rapturous fun of Awaiting on You All, we finally arrive at the title track, All Things Must Pass. I can't believe that John and Paul overlooked this song. I honestly think they were scared of how good it is, how it perfectly closes this chapter of their lives. What a beautiful conclusion it could have been to their final album together. A mature and sincere meditation on life and death. The music is a definite homage to Robbie Robertson and the band, while the lyrics are based on a Timothy Leary poem, which itself is a psychedelic adaptation of the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. On top of the song acting as a statement on the end of the Beatles, All Things Must Pass carries with it an even heavier weight when acknowledging the death of Harrison's devoted mother Louise after a lengthy period of illness. Following on from the title track is then probably the weakest song on the album, I Dig Love. A playful and listenable enough song, but when compared to the rest of the gold on the album, it certainly stands out as the first to go if you were ever to pare down the number of tracks. But hey, the lyrical content is hard to argue with, a jaunty ditty dedicated to free love. But then we get the insanely infectious and rollicking Art of Dying. Man, this song goes so hard. Another early composition from 1966. Its up-tempo rhythm shows almost a hint of early disco, but with an eerie, foreboding atmosphere. The lyrics, however, examine the incredibly complex subject of the moment your soul leaves your body and reincarnation. It's another example of George Harrison's maturity, that a man in his mid-20s had such a deep understanding of the Hindu concept of reincarnation that he could turn it into a blistering rock song that also defied the superficiality of the very music business he was in. And I know I've ragged on the guy in the past, but Eric Clapton's guitar solo here is woof. Now, before I finish with the final song on what many consider to be the core album, I'll briefly discuss the set of instrumental rock tracks known as Apple Jam. All Things Must Pass is considered rock's very first triple album by a single act. And on sides 5 and 6 of this LP, George Harrison and co. showcase why, with their stellar talents as a jam band. These tracks consist of Out of the Blue, an 11-minute blues banger that features Klaus Voormann ripping it up on the guitar in the style of Clapton. Plug Me In, a rollicking track that sees Harrison, Clapton, and Dave Mason trading guitar solos a la The End, with Jerry Lee Lewis-inspired piano from Bobby Whitlock. I Remember Jeep opens with strange Moog synthesizer effects before a bluesy, hand-clapping rock instrumental plays out for 8 minutes. Thanks to the Pepperoni sees the guitarists trade more solos between them over a Chuck Berry-styled rocker. And finally we have the absurd It's Johnny's Birthday.
It's Johnny's birthday, it's Johnny's birthday.
A twisted and demented carnival nightmare with plenty of Harrison humor. The 49-second track was created for John Lennon's 30th birthday after Yoko Ono requested a gift from Harrison. Sung to the tune of Cliff Richard's Congratulations, it's one of the kookiest recordings of Harrison's career. As I previously mentioned, many don't consider Apple Jam to be officially part of the core album of songs, as they were only included to justify the high price of the triple LP. But personally, I'm glad they were added on. Usually, when I listen to the album, I'll typically stop after side 4, but at the same time, the jams exist as a rollickingly fun victory lap, like the credits of a movie you're not quite ready to leave after it's over, and I don't know, I think that's pretty cool. But the final track on the core All Things Must Pass is Harrison's sweeping hymn for salvation, Hear Me Lord. A song about a relationship with God, but without the catchy upbeat quality of previous tracks on this album. Instead, it exhibits a naked, desperate longing. To me, this song has parallels with John Lennon. Both Lennon and Harrison's 1970 album Closers were about a higher power, but where Lennon declares that God is a concept by which we measure our pain, Harrison is asking from the depths of his soul, as Lennon did in 1965, for help. Help to love with more feeling, to rise a little higher. This is a man at an inflection point, about to leave everything he knew behind and venture into the mysterious unknown. It's emotional and incredibly riveting. A superb operatic finale. What George Harrison achieved on All Things Must Pass was nothing short of miraculous, especially when you consider that he played the role of songwriter, singer, guitarist, and co-producer all at the tender age of 27. But that all of these songs are great, many of them genuinely excellent, is the true miracle. You could pick any 3 tracks off this album and call them the best, and it would be hard to argue with you. The sheer amount of genres covered in the final product shows just how versatile Harrison's talents were, not only as a musician, but as a lover of music. Here he opened us up to the full dimensions of his spirituality and invited us to love in a new way, to the extent that listening to this album is a holy and cosmic experience. Even before I started, I knew I was going to make a good album because I had so many songs and I had so much energy. For me to do my own album after all that, it was joyous. Dream of dreams. It's not only George Harrison's best solo album, but the best solo album of any of the 4 Beatles. I'm sorry, Ram, you hold a dear place in my heart, but there's just no topping this. I have no hesitation calling it a masterpiece. It was the album that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that although Lennon and McCartney's songwriting steered the Beatles ship to success in the early days, by the band's end, it was clear that George Harrison was as gifted a musical genius as either John or Paul. And perhaps he was even better. 10 out of 10. So that's my ranking of George Harrison's post-Beatles studio albums. A spiritual odyssey that paints a spectacular portrait of one man's quest for love and truth. But before I sum up the seismic impact of George Harrison's music, we've got a few more albums that shed even more light on his immeasurable influence on the world. To begin with, we're going all the way back to 1968 to the earliest solo Beatle album, and the first on their new Apple Records label. I am of course talking about Wonderwall Music. While working on the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour, George Harrison was approached by far-out American director Joe Massett, who asked George if he'd like to compose the soundtrack to Massett's new film, Wonderwall. George wasn't certain of his abilities as he'd never done anything like this before, but Massett insisted he'd have full creative control. Harrison was intrigued by the plot, a stuffy, introverted scientist who discovers a secret hole in the wall to his neighbor's apartment, a hot young swinging 60s couple who are into psychedelia and making love. The scientist soon grows into an obsessed peeping Tom, becoming infatuated with the object, or Penny Lane as she's called, and eventually saves her life at the end of the film. Yeah, the plot's kind of rubbish, but its attempts to explore isolation and the dangers of fame and celebrity obsession were themes that rather appealed to George Harrison. As George's interest in Indian music was at a peak in the late 60s, he decided he would approach the assignment as an opportunity to spread the word and hook people into the beauty of non-Western music. He'd already demonstrated this with the Beatles songs Love You Too and Within You Without You, but this would give him an opportunity to fully explore the musical anthology of Indian music for Western ears. He travelled to Mumbai to work with some of the finest Indian musicians, some working with him again on the Dark Horse tour in 1974. George's method of scoring was to watch the film with a couple of stopwatches to time out the passages of music he would compose. He also enlisted the help of his friend and fellow Shankar pupil, John Barham, to translate, arrange and organise Harrison's various musical ideas, from the mysterious microbes to the pure psychedelia of Dream Scene. Even the honky-tonk silliness of Drilling a Home shows an impressive musical dexterity from the young guitarist. most stunning track is Love Scene, an enchanting number that utilizes double-tracked sarods, something that had never been done before in Indian music. Wonderwall music is a curious mix of mostly Indian music and some Western rock that scores a film from the dying days of the 60s belief that young artists could enlighten the world. In that regard, the film is very much of its time, but the score remains a fascinating introduction to the genesis of world music, something George Harrison was at the forefront of pioneering. George lent the other odd song or two to film soundtracks in the 80s, but never did anything else quite on the scale of Wonderwall music. A few songs from the handmade film Shanghai Surprise ended up on Cloud 9, but the other couple from the movie aren't really worth mentioning. Instead, it's time to discuss George Harrison's first instrumental album that wasn't made for a film, an album that wasn't really made for anyone with ears, for that matter, the 1969 experimental Electronic Sound. While in Los Angeles in 1968 producing Jackie Lomax's album, George Harrison was introduced to the Moog 3 synthesizer by Bernie Krause, the sales representative for the electronic instrument on the West Coast. This was during a period where Harrison had abandoned the guitar to learn the sitar, which subsequently led him to composing more tunes on keyboards such as Blue Jay Way from Magical Mystery Tour. One of the two lengthy recordings from Electronic Sound, No Time or Space, comprises an edit of a Moog demonstration given by Krause, which Harrison allegedly used for the album without his knowledge, upsetting Krause's ambition to introduce the Moog sound to the world on his own record. The other track, Under the Mersey Wall, was recorded by Harrison on his own Moog in Britain. One of the main issues was that the synth carried no instruction manual, meaning that Harrison barely knew how to operate it. The result is an album consisting of blips and blops, whistles and fizzes, and more disorientating zaps and zorps, as if someone recorded R2-D2 malfunctioning over the course of 43 minutes. Like John and Yoko's 3 albums of the late 60s, it was released on Apple's avant-garde subsidiary label, Zapple. But unlike John and Yoko, George had the good sense to stop at one release. The best I can say about it is that it contributed to the genesis of instruments in popular music, showcased by the fact that George Harrison introduced the Moog to the Beatles' sonic palette, where it features on Abbey Road. But otherwise, it's just noise, man. George Harrison, despite his aversion to the Beatles during his solo career, was not someone who craved singular attention or individual pop fame. What he really loved was to be part of a band, whether it be the pre-fame Beatle years or his 1974 Dark Horse tour band, or even the Monty Python guys. Being able to melt into the background was his preferred status in a group. And after the release of Cloud 9, he was presented with an opportunity to join one last band. The group came together by chance. Basically, George Harrison and Jeff Lynne were in LA where Roy Orbison offered to sing on a track they were working on. To save money, the three of them utilized Bob Dylan's home studio to record it, but George left his guitar at Tom Petty's house, who came to deliver it, and thus the Traveling Wilburys were born.
The thing happened completely just by magic, just by circumstances. Maybe there was a full moon that night or something like that.
The band began recording before they even considered a full album. Their first single was a Harris song that was completed with the group after they spotted a label on a box in Bob Dylan's garage that said, "Handle with care." A wonderful track with a charming chord progression that showcases the group's distinct vocal abilities, from the grisly Dylan to the angelic vibrato of Orbison.
Won't you show me that you really care?
And with Dylan's trademark harmonica and Harrison's slide guitar, the track was destined to become a classic. The whole band gave various contributions to all tracks on their first album, Traveling Wilburys Volume 1, although each song was written mainly by a single member. Harrison's key track was Heading for the Light, an upbeat rocker that reflects George rediscovering his spiritual purpose with some great backing vocals and powerful saxophone. Harrison also contributed heavily to the irresistibly catchy End of the Line. This is the most Beatles-esque track on the whole album and showcases the vocal talents of everyone save for Dylan. You've also got longtime drummer of Harrison's, Jim Keltner, striking a great beat on the Skins.
Well, it's all right.
Man, Jim Keltner, he really seems like he's just one of the most humble guys in rock and roll. This is another one of those songs you've heard a million times in movie trailers, most likely due to its feel-good affability. Like, I think there's literally a Tom Hanks movie out right now that used it.
Well, it's all right.
How did you get in here?
Elsewhere, there's good old-fashioned skiffle on Rattled. Last Night contains a sunny mood reflecting on an amusing evening. Roy Orbison's vocals at the end of Not Alone. You've even got a classic Dylan folktale on Tweeter and the Monkey Man. Obviously, this didn't happen to everyone, but you know when you're a kid and your dad and his buddies got together to play guitar music to the songs of their youth? Well, that's what's going on here, except it's these guys. What's so magical about this album is that you really get a sense of the fun they're having. There was no time to add any production gloss, so it feels raw and carefree, but that's 100% the appeal. This isn't an album you listen to for innovation, but to feel the infectious spontaneity of it all. Fueled by beer and coffee, these fellas created some of the most rambunctious and delightful tunes of their careers. It's energetic, tongue-in-cheek, and sounds absolutely wonderful. Yeah, Traveling Wilburys Volume 1 rips, man. I love this record. Comparing it to George's solo work doesn't really count because it's a true group effort, but I think it's better than Cloud 9. It's the Cloud 9 fans. After the success of Volume 1, Roy Orbison tragically died of a heart attack. Despite this truly unfortunate event, the remaining Wilburys decided to make a second album.
I mean, we love Roy. Life flows on within you and without you, and he's around, you know, in his astral body.
With Harrison coming up with the amusing idea of calling it Traveling Wilburys Volume 3. While not quite as good as Volume 1, Volume 3 sticks with the blues roots formula to create more charming rock and skiffle tracks. However, the absence of Roy Orbison's voice and personality is a significant loss, and the breezy and cheerful vibe of the first LP isn't felt quite as strongly. Perhaps to fill the huge void of Orbison, George Harrison's guitar work is more prominent on this album. He even creates a twin sitar and slide guitar solo on The Devil's Been Busy. The song 7 Deadly Sins has some beguiling doo-wop harmonies.
7, 7, 7 deadly sins.
The Spanish rhythm of New Blue Moon has a great feel to it that reminds me of Paul McCartney's song Hope of Deliverance from Off the Ground. Plus it features Bob Dylan scatting these lethargic yahoos that always make me chuckle. Traveling Wilburys Volume 3 is a fun romp, but ultimately demonstrated that the magic born out of musical spontaneity can only last for so long, and was the final Wilburys album. The Traveling Wilburys created some real late career frivolity for a bunch of aging rock and rollers, pondering their existence in the modern music world. When people bring up the term supergroup, they are always the first band that I think of, and through amusing pseudonyms, members like Harrison and Dylan could hide from their own superstardom and get back to their initial love, making carefree music with their mates. As far as George Harrison compilations go, there are some to avoid and some that are essential. Basically, any of those studio cash-grabbing compilations from before the year 2000 are not worth it. I can recommend Let It Roll, the songs from George Harrison from 2009, which does a fairly decent job of spanning his entire solo career. But by far the best one, and it's not really even a compilation, but I have brought it up previously in this video, is Early Takes Volume 1 from 2011, which was released alongside Martin Scorsese's 3-hour documentary on George Harrison, Living in the Material World. These are mostly acoustic demos or early takes of some of Harrison's best songs. They maintain this naked vulnerability and raw beauty that always leaves me in awe every time I listen to this album. And to George Harrison's estate, we're still waiting on Volume 2. It's now been 12 years. And finally, to George Harrison's live albums. If you want to hear the hits of his solo career and the Beatles, I would recommend Live in Japan from 1992, opening with I Want to Tell You and continuing with cuts like Taxman, If I Needed Someone, and Piggies. Here is where you can finally listen to George Harrison play songs live from his non-touring Beatle years that people had been waiting nearly 3 decades for. Joined by Eric Clapton, he also plays a fairly safe list of solo tracks, including a full-voiced Dark Horse, but the rest are essentially All Things Must Pass or Cloud 9 cuts. This is a highly polished and inviting live album that picks up energy as it moves along, culminating in a powerful and nostalgic encore. Plus, I really dig the album artwork. Rewind 20 years to George Harrison's previous and only other live tour from 1974, which unfortunately has never seen an official release. The Dark Horse tour was obviously marred by Harrison's hoarse vocals, but the parts of it that I have seen and heard from bootlegs are absolutely riveting. Playing with a band that specialized in funk and R&B, plus a host of Indian musicians, this tour made for some truly wild and eclectic offerings that I would kill to see and hear in an official capacity, laryngitis be damned. I'll quickly add that 1 year on from his death, the concert for George was made to honour and commemorate the late artist. Several of George's friends, including some Wilburys, Python pals, and of course Paul and Ringo, celebrate the man by playing a blockbuster setlist of songs from his Beatle years, All Things Must Pass, and the single Give Me Love. But otherwise, the only other song featured out of his entire solo career is randomly an album track from Gone Troppo, That's the Way It Goes.
That's the way it goes.
The highlight to me will always be McCartney's tribute and ukulele version of Something.
Something in the way she moves.
Which he still performs in concerts to this day. But if you want the ultimate live George Harrison album, you need look no further than the groundbreaking world-first Concert for Bangladesh. The splitting of Bangladesh, or what was formerly known as Eastern Pakistan, from the rest of the Pakistani state resulted in millions of displaced Bengali refugees. Ravi Shankar, overcome by the devastation of his homeland, turned to his friend George for help.
Mr. Harrison, with all of the enormous problems in the world, how did you happen to choose this one to do something about?
Because I was asked by a friend if I'd help, that's all.
Harrison, despite his aversion to playing live, sought out the biggest venue possible, Madison Square Garden, and enlisted all the help he could get from his musical friends. This resulted in a band spanning Indian classical, folk, blues, gospel soul, southern rock, and British pop rock, who all together generated a real-life wall of sound, especially with the double drumming impact of Keltner and Starr. Highlights of the set include the mesmerising Bangladesh from the likes of Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar Khan, George's live debut as a solo artist with the explosive Wah Wah, a truly stirring rendition of Beware of Darkness and Here Comes the Sun. Bob Dylan's mini set of 5 songs is a total revelation, especially considering the touch-and-go nature of him appearing at all. It's hard to pick a favourite of his, but Blowing in the Wind and the three-way voices of Harrison, Russell and Dylan on Just Like a Woman are 2 standout moments.
Just like a woman.
I mean, it's all jaw-dropping stuff. You also get one of Harrison's most powerful vocal performances on the song written for the benefit, the rousing Bangladesh, driven not by a desire to be an enigmatic frontman, but a faithful conviction to help his friend and hopefully save some lives. Harrison's emotional resonance on this finale is positively riveting. But my absolute highlight is Billy Preston stealing the show just like he did in Get Back with an electrifying performance of That's the Way God Planned It, where he was so energized by the song that he got up on stage and, well, in his words,
the band was jamming and it was pumping, the people were with us and, just had to rejoice.
The concert for Bangladesh was legendary. Not only did it reunite 2 Beatles on stage for the first time since 1966, it also featured Bob Dylan's first live performance in 5 years. But most importantly, it was the world's first multi-artist charity benefit gig and set a towering example of what such an event can achieve. With the proceeds exceeding $240,000, this concert formed the template for future rock benefits such as Live Aid. You actually can't stream this album. I bought it on iTunes, and I believe it's because the sales of the album continued to benefit George Harrison's UNICEF fund. The concert was just one example of how George Harrison literally changed the world with his kindness and his music. If you watch the Concert for Bangladesh video on the Beatles YouTube channel, the top comment is from a Bangladeshi man who says, "During our liberation war in 1971, that money from that concert helped us a lot. And now the name George Harrison and his great work for our liberation is written in the textbooks of every children in our country. I am a 12th class student and I am giving entrance exams for different universities and I literally have to know the details of this concert to appear in the tests. Thank you, George Harrison." Stepping out from the shadow of the Beatles was always going to be a daunting task for George Harrison, someone who had no ambition or ego to eclipse his former bandmates, but through sheer musical genius, still did. Harrison would never consider himself a genius, though. A man who practiced shedding his ego over the course of his life was hardly going to be a great cheerleader of his own work, but George Harrison's music is truly in a league of its own. When we talk about innovation, sure, Lennon and McCartney created endless bursts of new ideas and sonic textures, but by introducing Indian music into Western rock, George Harrison shifted the pop music world on its axis. This union of musical styles allowed for glorious new sounds, textures, time signatures, and chord progressions that were pivotal to the history of world music. But for Harrison, it was the spiritual aspiration of Indian music, to form a connection, a relationship with God that began a lifelong path of devotion. Where other artists of the 60s and 70s bought into fads but quickly moved on to whichever caught their eye next, George Harrison never gave up on his spiritual journey and quest for love and truth in music. This corresponds to Harrison's approach as a musician to service the song above all else. Even back in his Beatle days, George wasn't a flashy guitarist interested in wild solos and flamboyant antics. His contributions were in the intricate details and moving arrangements. This approach led to his ultimate musical expression through the slide guitar, which allowed him to access the myriad of tones and cadences of Indian ragas, conveying his spiritual vision more than words ever could. And when he did sing, his power came not from innate technical ability, but from unyielding conviction and stunning emotional expression. At its center, George Harrison's musical cornerstone was his gift for melody, allowing for a timelessness in his songs that will hold up long after production trickery and sonic trends fall out of fashion. I'm not sure George Harrison ever really knew how beloved he was, but I know for sure that he was a deep and truly special person. Not many people come along like George Harrison. His humility, kindness, sense of humor, and his divine musical expression was a gift to the world. Hare Krishna, George. We miss you.
They say I'm not what I used to be. All the same, I'm happier than a willow tree. Shine on.
A lot has been said about the future of self-driving cars. Some people take a very negative position, claiming that autonomous vehicles are a pipe dream and will never become a reality. They're just another example of the overhyped nonsense that's typical of tech companies these days. And that may be true, but in several US cities today, you can literally open an app, select your destination, and a car with nobody in it will pick you up and drive you there automatically. So self-driving cars are here today, which leads to the other kind of commentary I often see online, that self-driving cars are real, they will be coming to more cities soon, and they will solve all of our transportation problems. They'll make the roads safer, they'll eliminate traffic congestion, they'll be environmentally friendly, they'll provide mobility to everyone, and our cities will be better than ever. I actually disagree with both of these positions, which is why I wanted to make this video, because I do believe that self-driving cars are real and they will be in every city in the near future. The technology is getting better every day, and if these improvements continue on this track, they will fundamentally destroy the fabric of our cities. There is a cautious optimism among many urbanists about self-driving cars. After all, the majority of problems within cities are caused by cars. Traffic, pollution, noise, dangerous streets. And there never seems to be enough space available for sidewalks, bike lanes, parks, or anything else because it's all been turned into wide roads and parking lots. Anybody who has tried to get around without a car in a car-centric city knows that human drivers can be really scary, especially when they're speeding or driving distracted, which happens way too often. So having cars driven by computers can't possibly be worse than what we have now, right? And it is possible that with the right incentives and regulations, that could be our future. But given the course we're on, I believe that future is increasingly unlikely, especially when you consider the history of how automobiles destroyed cities in the 20th century, but also the effects of money and capital. It's estimated that over $160 billion has already been invested into the development of autonomous vehicles. So there is a lot of money riding on this technology and therefore a lot of pressure to get self-driving cars to market as soon as possible. When people see these vehicles cruising around the streets of San Francisco, they might believe that this technology is right around the corner. You can go there right now and see them dropping off passengers. They follow the speed limit and appear to drive cautiously. And it's amazing to see that there's nobody in the driver's seat, but that doesn't mean they're always driven by computer. As of last November, Cruise confirmed that their robotaxis required human assistance every 4 to 5 miles. I don't know how often this is needed today, but you don't have to watch these cars for very long to see that humans definitely still need to take remote control sometimes. This stupid robotaxi got stuck behind a construction toilet trailer until someone in the call center could steer it around. This one sat here for several light cycles because it didn't think it could turn right. The drivers behind it eventually gave up waiting and just drove around. Now, you might be wondering about these remote assistant agents who take control. Who are these people? Where are they located? How much are they paid? What are the working conditions like? But never mind all that. It's a technological miracle, okay? Just shut up and get in the car. Now, of course, this technology will inevitably get better, but nobody knows how long it will take to sort out the long tail of rare occurrences that a self-driving car will encounter in a busy city. And as any experienced product manager will tell you, the first 90% of a project takes 90% of the time, and the last 10% of the project will take the other 90%. The technology is advanced, but fundamentally, self-driving cars are stupid. They're mindless. They make a bunch of dumb mistakes. Recently, in this parking lot for self-driving cars, Waymo vehicles started driving in circles and randomly honking at each other. This happened for days, and this particular video was taken at 4 a.m. The people who live next door were not impressed. There have been dozens of official reports of driverless cars getting in the way of rescue operations, from blocking ambulances to crashing into fire trucks. But it gets worse. Last October, a woman was hit by a car in San Francisco driven by a human driver and knocked into the path of a Cruise robotaxi. Cruise said the vehicle, quote, braked aggressively to minimize impact, and while the robo-taxi couldn't stop fast enough to avoid hitting the woman, it still reacted faster than any human could. So that's a win for self-driving cars, right? Except that the woman then fell under the car, so as far as the robo-taxi was concerned, she was gone. So it continued to drive, dragging her underneath. A key detail that crews initially tried to hide from the press and regulators.
It's a first for police and fire departments involving a driverless car.
The victim was found to be under the left rear wheel of the vehicle.
Thankfully, the woman survived and cruise cars were taken off the roads, but this is a scary example of how these cars will make new mistakes that we haven't even considered yet. They are not intelligent. They don't even have the object permanence of a toddler. But that hasn't stopped them from being beta tested on public roads, and the citizens of these cities did not agree to this. Several groups in California have protested against being the involuntary test subjects of multi-billion-dollar tech companies. And a Waymo car was even set on fire earlier this year. Self-driving cars have caused a lot of problems in San Francisco.
Waymo cars in San Francisco reportedly caused a big traffic jam just as baseball fans were leaving Oracle Park Monday afternoon. A KTVU viewer shared this video you're looking at showing two self-driving cars stopped in the middle of the Embarcadero.
The advocacy group Safe Street Rebel has published video evidence of self-driving cars running red lights, cutting off drivers, cutting off pedestrians, clogging up intersections, blocking streets, blocking public transit, parking in bike lanes, and what the hell is this car doing to that old woman? So the idea that these cars will always obey the rules of the road is a fantasy. Safe Street Rebel also organizes events like the Week of Cone. Since self-driving cars are programmed to avoid traffic cones at all costs, one of the best way to incapacitate one is to put a traffic cone on its hood. This is called coning, and it's fucking hilarious. I'm sure these mega corporations will lobby to make this a criminal offense, so do it now while you still can. Safe Street Rebel does a lot of great advocacy work that goes beyond reining in tech companies, so definitely check them out if you live in or near San Francisco. I'll leave a link in the description. These protests may slow adoption, but let's face it, there is no way in hell we're going to stop these things from coming to our cities when there are hundreds of billions of dollars on the line. And to be clear, most of these incidents would not have even happened if the self-driving car companies still had safety drivers like they used to. But they're under so much pressure to deliver that they'd rather fuck up the city and even potentially kill people rather than to admit that the technology isn't ready yet. Tech companies proudly say that they move fast and break things, and maybe that broken thing will be your spine under a robo-taxi, but that's a risk they're willing to take. Self-driving car companies have already lobbied politicians to allow them to operate based only on self-certification, and they've successfully stopped laws that require them to report extensive safety data. Recently, California passed a bill that says police can't even ticket self-driving car companies when their cars violate traffic laws. It may be that eventually, on average, self-driving cars will be safer than human drivers in the future, but it is incredibly naive to believe that they will not introduce new safety problems of their own. A self-driving car will try to avoid hitting people and objects, and there are dozens of sensors to make sure that doesn't happen. But these sensors are not infallible and they require interpretation by software. It's important for self-driving cars not to crash into things that are there, but it's also important that they don't stop for things that aren't. Like this Tesla in self-driving mode that suddenly came to a stop on the highway and caused an 8-car pileup. You don't want a self-driving car to stop just because there's a bit of garbage blown onto the road or it detects something that won't cross the path of the vehicle anyway. So the software needs to evaluate every object that it detects. The first person to ever be killed by a self-driving car was a woman in Tempe, Arizona in 2018. She was crossing this road at night while pushing a bicycle and was hit by a modified Volvo SUV driven autonomously by the automated driving system developed by Uber. So why didn't all of this advanced technology prevent killing her? It's not that the car didn't detect her, it's just that it didn't think she was anything worth stopping for. The crash report from the NTSB provides a detailed explanation. The car flipped between identifying her as a vehicle to a bicycle to a general other category. Sometimes it detected her as being in another lane and other times as a static object that wasn't moving. The software didn't consider her to be an important object that was going to cross the path of the SUV until 1.2 seconds before the crash, when it was too late to stop without killing her. So when a self-driving car starts driving towards you, you better hope it hasn't detected you as other. But all this talk about sensors and self-driving obfuscates the real root cause of this crash, which is the atrocious state of American traffic engineering. This area is designed like a freeway with a high speed limit and almost no accommodations for people walking, despite being directly between a rail station and hiking trails. At the time of the crash, the median had a paved roadway designed only to be used by cars if one of the bridges was closed, but it clearly looked like a walking path and it was regularly used by people crossing this road. Instead of any actual pedestrian infrastructure, the city just put up these "use crosswalk" signs that are still there today. It's disgraceful that traffic engineers put up these signs in a natural place where people would want to cross the road instead of, actually building a crosswalk here. But what's worse is that in 2018, it wasn't even physically possible to walk to the crosswalk because of the trees and greenery that had been planted here. Since the crash, the solution has been to turn the brick roadway into a rough stone path that is hostile to pedestrians. But they've now cut a hole through the cacti so that it is at least theoretically possible to reach the crosswalk now, though you still have to walk over 200 meters out of your way, plus the time it takes to wait for your turn to cross this highway. American traffic engineers routinely bend over backwards to make driving as convenient as possible, while making these places actively hostile to pedestrians, then blame the pedestrians when they're hit by a car. In the US, around 42,000 people are killed in car crashes every year, and hundreds of thousands are seriously injured, sometimes with debilitating injuries that will affect them for the rest of their lives. So it's not surprising that the most prominent feature promised by these American self-driving car companies is safety. But the US also has some of the most dangerous roads in the developed world. The most deadly kind of road in the US is the Strode, a road designed for high-speed travel that also tries to act as a destination. Strodes are rare in other countries, especially inside of cities, but they are all over the US and Canada. The nonprofit organization Strong Towns has been warning about the dangers of this kind of road design for over a decade, and I have a previous video about Strodes if you'd like to learn more. There has been decades of research into road safety, and we know how to make the roads safer, such as the Vision Zero method developed in Sweden in the 1990s. In fact, if the US had roads as safe as Sweden, they would cut their road fatalities by over 80%, without any new technology at all. But many of these design changes require slowing or restricting cars, and that's a step too far for the US. There's no money to be made in making the streets safer, so the only solution to the dangers caused by the old cars has to be buying new cars. Self-driving car companies do not care about road safety, they care about selling cars and technology. They care about safety in so much as it allows them to sell cars. The moment they can convince regulators and the general public that their cars are safe enough, they will stop caring about safety. So you can expect the messaging to pretty quickly go from preventing road deaths to being, yeah, sure, they kill people, but our marketing department says it's less often than human drivers would, so it's fine. And even if they are safer than American drivers on American roads, the rest of the world is going to get these cars whether we want them or not. And that's an interesting thing to consider because right now, these vehicles are being trained in some of the most car-centric places on Earth. The first locations were undoubtedly chosen because they have very good weather, but I guarantee you that Phoenix, Arizona was also a top choice because it is literally like driving on easy mode. The roads are insanely wide. There are almost no restrictions on where cars can go. It's made up of square grid blocks a mile on each side, and pretty much everybody drives everywhere all the time already. To say that Phoenix is car dependent is a massive understatement. If anthropomorphic cars could design cities, they would design Phoenix. It's also one of the most dangerous places for pedestrians in the entire developed world, but don't worry about that. Self-driving cars will fix everything. San Francisco is certainly more urban. There are people who walk and cycle, and there are public transit vehicles as well. But I've lived in the Bay Area, and I can tell you that even San Francisco is pretty car-centric and car-friendly compared to most cities in Europe, which I think is going to be a problem when this technology is rolled out internationally. These cars are trained to drive like Americans on American roads where cars are considered superior and above all other forms of transportation. Have you seen an American when they try to drive in Europe for the first time? It's not pretty. Of course, these tech companies could spend years retraining their vehicles to drive like Europeans on European streets, but you and I both know that's not going to happen. They're going to set American-trained cars loose on European streets. I hope I'm wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised if European cities are pressured to Americanize their streets to make them more self-driving friendly. Which brings us to another potential issue with these cars. They are not so much programmed as they are trained. They learned how to drive by monitoring what real human drivers did through millions of miles of driving. So let's say that in the future, a city wants to change the way their streets work, to improve safety, to speed up public transit, or to make more room for walking and cycling, whatever. It won't be enough to just put up a sign and update the rules of the road. Governments will need to convince every self-driving car company to retrain their cars, and given that these are multi-billion-dollar international corporations with an army of lobbyists, how likely do you think it is that those changes will go through? This could result in our cities getting locked into what they are today, with any new changes being dictated by car companies, which I guarantee you is not going to favor anything that results in fewer cars. Of course, there are a lot of problems with our current transportation system, but I am skeptical that self-driving cars will truly solve any of them, because apart from the supposed safety claims, when you boil it down, self-driving cars are really just promising to be cheaper taxis. Yeah, they're not driven by a human, or at least not driven by a human who is currently in the car with you, but otherwise, they're just cheaper taxis, right? Like, do you seriously believe that all of our urban transportation problems would be solved tomorrow if only taxis were cheaper? And I'm even skeptical about the cheaper part. We saw this happen with Uber and Lyft when app-requested ride-sharing was introduced. Uber was cheap, that is, when the venture capitalist money was flowing. In fact, it was so cheap that several cities in the US reduced investment in public transit in favor of subsidizing rideshare rides, and it worked for a while. But taking an Uber isn't cheap anymore, and I'll leave a link to this great article with an analysis of why those price increases can't be explained by an increase in costs, rideshare legislation, or inflation. They raised prices because the owners and investors of those companies wanted a big return on their investments. The exact same thing is playing out now with self-driving cars. Hundreds of billions of venture capital are flowing into the development of autonomous vehicles, and companies like Waymo are using that money to make their robotaxi rides price competitive to traditional taxis. And I find it wild that people online will unironically say things like, in the future, AVs will be cheaper than taxis because there's no driver to pay. Like, do you honestly believe that the prices that companies charge are based on what they cost to deliver? Of course they aren't. They charge as much as possible to maximize profits, and once they've eliminated or colluded with the competition, they can charge whatever they want. And I shouldn't even need to say this, but turning your transportation system over to a handful of multi-billion-dollar corporations does not result in good outcomes for anybody except the owners of those corporations. It's commonly claimed that self-driving cars will reduce the amount of cars on the road and eliminate parking lots. The idea is that you will be dropped off at the door by a self-driving car and you won't need to park. And that's true, but you can literally do that today, right? You could just take a taxi to work every day instead of owning a car, but very few people actually do this. Sure, it's expensive to take taxis everywhere, of course, but even wealthy people don't do this because people just like owning their own stuff and being in their own car. There's this vague promise that your car could earn extra money for you as a taxi while you're at work, but How many people want their private car to end up looking and smelling like the inside of a taxi? So those cars are going to need to park somewhere, and their owners will want them parked nearby so that they don't take too long to arrive when they're ready to go. And you can forget about ever charging for parking, because if it's cheaper to just let your car cruise around the block while you're shopping or at work, then that's what people will do. Another common claim is that these cars will allow universal mobility to everyone, especially the disabled, but many people with disabilities require help from others to get in and out of a vehicle or to secure a wheelchair, so an attendant will likely be needed on board anyway. And given that you need a credit card and a modern smartphone to book a robo-taxi, this puts it out of reach of many people. Sure, the rich boomer with a bad hip will be taken care of, but they can already take a taxi today. This is really just an extension of the often repeated myth that cars are the only transportation that works for disabled people, and that as long as you have cars, disabled people are taken care of. This is a great article by disability advocates about how self-driving cars are a distraction to the solutions that they actually need, and I'll leave a link to it in the description. But of all of the claims made by proponents of self-driving cars, the one that I find most ridiculous is the idea that they will reduce traffic congestion. There is absolutely no reason to believe that this is true, and lots of historical evidence to suggest that it is not. Every single time that we have done anything to make transportation cheaper or more convenient, the inevitable outcome is that people travel more often and they travel longer distances. There is decades of well-documented evidence that every time we widen roads or build new highways, it increases the amount of driving, and I talked about that in more detail in my video about induced demand. When Uber and Lyft came to cities, they also claimed that they would reduce traffic congestion. But the exact opposite happened, and vehicle miles traveled increased significantly. This will only become worse with robo-taxis because people will take them even more often than they do Ubers today, especially while they're heavily subsidized. I've seen some people claim that robo-taxis will reduce the number of cars in cities because they will park in parking lots on the edge of town and only come in when they're requested, but I don't believe that for a second, because one of the major competitive factors between robotaxi companies is going to be how quickly they can get to their customers. Consider how impatient people get while waiting for an elevator. There is no way in hell that people in the future will want to wait 14 minutes for a robotaxi pickup. Which is why the self-driving car parking lots today are right in the heart of San Francisco, but the future could be even worse. There's no cost to driving around most cities. Gas taxes are usually the only thing that even comes close to a user fee for city streets, but regardless, the robotaxi of the future will be electric and charged at private facilities. As long as the roads are free to use, there is zero incentive for these companies not to have robotaxis constantly circling the block so that they can respond to customers as quickly as possible. And when these cars are significantly less space efficient than buses or trams, that alone will result in less space available in our cities. But it gets worse. Consider today a suburban parent who drops off one child at elementary school, another at high school, and then drives to work. With self-driving cars, those kids will be sent in their own robotaxis, so that one-car trip today will become 3-car trips in the future. This is already happening in San Francisco, and it will only get worse. It's great for kids to have independent mobility, but we need to do that without just putting more cars on the road. In an earlier video, I talked about the problems that many European cities have already experienced after the introduction of 10-minute delivery services. And there are stories today from DoorDash drivers who are called to pick up trivially small orders like a single tube of toothpaste. As robotaxis become cheaper and more convenient, this is only going to become more common. They're going to be delivering anything within a few minutes with a car for every delivery. When cars became common, people didn't need to live near their work anymore, and cities started to sprawl as more car-dependent suburbs were built on the periphery. This resulted in huge volumes of traffic funneled into arterial roads and highways because there were more cars driving longer distances. Self-driving cars will only make this worse. When people are freed from having to pay attention to the road, they'll be able to go through their emails or take conference calls from their autonomous vehicles. So why live in a suburb at all? Why not live in a cottage in the middle of nowhere where land is plentiful and taxes are cheap? This will result in an exponential increase in the amount of vehicle miles traveled, with millions of cars driving very long distances regularly and putting even more strain on our transportation system. And it's going to make the existing problem of financing suburban infrastructure even worse. See my Strongtown series to learn how suburbanization and car-centric development is literally bankrupting North American suburbs already. But if you believe in the marketing of autonomous vehicles, then this technology will advance exponentially. Vehicles will communicate with each other to travel efficiently. Autonomous pods will merge seamlessly onto high-speed self-driving highways for even higher throughput and speeds. And vehicles will be more efficient than ever through platooning or whatever. In this vision of the future, the transportation problems of today will seem laughably archaic, and we will achieve levels of efficiency we could only dream of. Here's a marketing video from Ford showing what they think the city of the future will be like. Look at all these problems with a modern city. Of course, these problems were caused by people using their cars in the first place, but don't worry about that, because buying their new cars will fix everything, so it's fine. Look, there are e-bikes and parks, futuristic trains, less parking. People can cross the street wherever they want, and magic crosswalks will appear. There are vacuum trains, pedestrian plazas, blue skies, and lots of trees. Every single problem will be solved. What's not to like? But before we get too excited about our utopian self-driving future, it's worth looking back at previous promises of the automobile industry. At the 1939 New York World's Fair, General Motors presented Futurama, the high-tech city of the future in the year 1960. This exhibit was absolutely huge. They had a ride that would take you over the city and even a life-size model of an urban neighborhood. In Futurama, car traffic would be eliminated completely with advanced motorways. These would be separated from all other traffic and allow cars to drive faster than ever before. Pedestrians would be able to comfortably walk through the city on elevated walkways while car traffic was safely whisked away on the roads below. But the reality was quite different. The motorways promised by Futurama were built, but they just induced demand for more driving and more car ownership. Which was the car industry's real purpose in the first place, of course. They wanted to sell more cars. Instead of being the salvation of the city, elevated freeways divided and destroyed neighborhoods. They flooded city streets with car traffic, increased pollution, and left municipalities with massive tax burdens and maintenance liabilities. To the point where many cities have spent billions to remove urban freeways in an attempt to repair the damage. There are many accounts online that show the destruction that happened to American cities because of car infrastructure, and I'll leave some links in the description. My point here is that new transportation technology can and will fundamentally change our cities, especially if there's money to be made. So we need to seriously consider how AVs could negatively affect cities so that we can prepare for them today. As AV technology improves, it will start to arrive in personal vehicles. Just like with cars, the first mass adoption will happen in suburbia, especially in the US and Canada. Suburbanites spend too much time sitting in traffic as it is, and it will allow those people to live even farther away from the city where property is even cheaper, so it will definitely be worth the cost for any reasonably wealthy suburbanite. And designing AVs for suburban roads is a much easier problem than for busy cities, so they'll be faster to market too. AVs will be proven safer than human drivers, so AV companies will lobby to have AV-only lanes installed on highways and throughout the suburbs. For those who can't afford their own autonomous vehicle, suburban municipalities will subsidize robotaxis in place of public transit. Entire suburban neighborhoods will be built that are only accessible by autonomous vehicle, which has the added benefit of keeping any undesirable people out. This is the next logical step to the gated communities that are already common across the US. Suburbs will rapidly expand to consume even more valuable land. Power lines, water pipes, sewage pipes, and all other infrastructure will become even longer and more spread out, but there'll be so much money and debt flooding into suburbs on the promise of building the city of the future that nobody will stop to think about it. And besides, the bills to maintain it all are decades away. In other words, literally exactly what happened in the post-war suburbs of the last century. Autonomous vehicle companies may be making record profits from suburbanites, but the line must go up, so they'll look towards the cities, and their primary objective will be to eliminate the competition. In the 1920s, Los Angeles had the largest electric streetcar network in the world, but service declined significantly as the streetcars got stuck in traffic behind cars. And the streetcars couldn't compete with a heavily subsidized road and highway system. Private streetcar companies were bought out by National City Lines, a company that was financed by General Motors and related companies and was specifically founded with a goal of tearing up streetcar lines throughout the U.S. because well-functioning public transit is a threat to car companies. History is going to repeat itself here. The companies who finance autonomous vehicles are going to do everything in their power to cancel transit projects, lobby against funding for public transportation, and replace public transit with their private robotaxis. There will be autonomous bus concepts promised, and some of these will go into operation to replace today's buses and trams, but the real money will be in private AVs and robotaxis. Robotaxis will be pitched as a more efficient form of transportation by offering door-to-door service, and any train or transit lines will be converted to AV lanes. But there's nothing more space efficient than a train. This 18-lane freeway in Toronto is over 100 meters wide, but it moves fewer people per day than this single subway line because trains are so much more space efficient than cars. In the early 1900s, the Brooklyn Bridge in New York moved over 420,000 people per day, but in the 1950s, the trolleys were removed to make way for cars. Since then, the Brooklyn Bridge has never moved more than 180,000 people per day, well under half as many as when there was public transit. The same thing is going to happen to our cities with AVs. The decrease in space efficiency moving from shared transit to private transportation, coupled with the massive increase in demand for cheap subsidized AV rides, will result in a massive increase in the number of vehicles in our cities. AV companies will lobby for some roads to be designated as autonomous only. This will be pitched as a way to increase safety and efficiency, but the ultimate goal will be to eliminate public transit and human driving and get everybody to sign up to an AV subscription instead. Here's how a concept of this called Loop NYC was pitched by a New York engineering company a few years back. In this video, they assigned certain streets in New York to be self-driving only. They claim that this will be so much more efficient that other streets could be blocked off to cars completely and turned into a giant linear park. But AV companies aren't going to be happy giving up any roads, as their success is dependent on offering door-to-door service. So AVs will be required to go everywhere. They'll even argue that AVs should also be allowed in pedestrian areas because they're safer than human drivers and will offer an important service for people with mobility issues. When there's no price put on driving, competing robotaxis will circle the block in order to have the quickest response times. Private AVs will drive around automatically to get the cheapest parking rates while their owners are at work. The parking lots that we were told would become obsolete will be converted to solar AV charging stations for both private AVs and robotaxis. And they'll jump between stations for whichever one has the cheapest prices. So despite what the car company propaganda might show you, AVs are not going to let us replace roads and parking lots with parks. Autonomous vehicles will demand even more space in our cities, and they're going to get it. The next problem will be pedestrians. As AVs become more common, people will realize they can cross the street wherever they want because AVs will always stop. And there is no way that AV companies are going to put up with that. They'll claim that people crossing the street are crippling the transportation system, and they'll demand that fences be put up along important streets and roads. Bamberg is a small town in the US state of South Carolina. Like pretty much every American town, they had a traditional main street. But this main street also became the main highway through town, and all of that downtown activity, and especially all those people crossing the street, was interfering with the flow of car traffic. So they decided to widen the street and install fences along the sidewalks to prevent people from crossing mid-block. After construction was done, car traffic moved much more efficiently. And within a few years, every single shop in downtown Bamberg went out of business, and today it looks like a ghost town. Because believe it or not, people don't enjoy being on a cramped sidewalk next to high-speed traffic. This was a monumentally stupid idea, of course, but I bring this up because before the project, the director of the Chamber of Commerce said that the project will, quote, be a major boost to the economy for the county and downtown Bamberg. There are a lot of people who genuinely believe that if car traffic moves more efficiently, then businesses will thrive, when the exact opposite is true. Cars don't buy things, people do. So if you make a place inhospitable to people, nobody will buy anything. Expect the same thing to happen with autonomous vehicles. As the fences go up, there'll be no reason for AVs to drive slowly, so they won't. Streets everywhere will be just like downtown Bamberg, inhospitable places where people won't want to be, and street life will slowly die. With public transit, human drivers, and pedestrians out of the way, AV companies will demand an end to speed limits. They'll argue that these restrictions, designed for human drivers, are irrelevant for vehicles driven by a computer. This will result in a huge increase in vehicle throughput and will be considered a tremendous success. But when AVs are driven faster, pedestrian and cyclist fatalities will increase. AVs may have lightning-fast reaction times, but at high speed, the laws of physics win every time. Now, there will be outcries when someone is killed, and people will demand to slow down AVs to make them safer, but history will repeat itself again. Today, cars are a reality that we deal with just about everywhere, but when automobiles were first introduced, people did not want them in their cities. Cars were clogging up city streets and killing thousands of people every year. By the 1920s, the general public was very anti-car. Several cities had plans to require speed governors on all cars entering the city, and they introduced high fines for dangerous driving. But the automobile industry was not about to go down without a fight. They fought to get car-friendly politicians elected and voted down any anti-car legislation. And did they do anything to make their cars less likely to kill people? No, of course not. They invented and spent millions promoting the concept of jaywalking to make it the fault of the victims for not looking where they were going. This changed cities almost overnight. Streets went from being a common place for everyone to a place exclusively for cars just a few decades later. The jaywalking of the 21st century will be the transponder that everyone will be required to wear when walking outside if they want to avoid being killed by a car. When someone is hit by an AV, people will ask, well, were they wearing their transponder? And the news will report, the victim was not wearing a LiDAR reflector. These faster cars will also create more pollution and noise. Cars are a major contributor to pollution within cities. Air quality will improve as cars transition to electric, but electric cars will not solve this problem. Because a major source of local pollution from cars comes from the erosion of the tires, brakes, asphalt, and road markings. And all of these emissions increase as cars get heavier and drive at higher speeds. Cars also create a lot of noise pollution in cities, and that is not just uncomfortable, it literally creates a stress response that leads to physical problems, and I've talked about that in a previous video. There's a common belief that electric cars will solve this noise problem, but that's not really true. Because once a car goes above about 50 kilometers per hour, the sound of the tires becomes louder than the sound of the engine, and this gets worse as cars get heavier. Plus, the faster the car goes, the louder this noise becomes. Many cars in Oslo are electric, but it's still very loud on this pedestrian bridge over the highway. With all of the extra electronics and computers, AVs will be heavier than today's cars, and they're going to be driven faster too, which will make the air toxic near autonomous vehicle highways. And the noise from the tires on the road surface will be deafening, making these areas uncomfortable and dangerous for anybody walking nearby. Eventually, AVs will consume every street in the city and push out every other form of transportation. The final step will be to remove traffic lights. About a decade ago, I saw this video produced by the University of Texas at Austin. They proposed a future protocol called AIM that would provide autonomous intersection management for high-speed intersections without traffic lights. This is the animation that made me really think twice about the future of self-driving cars, because when I looked at it, the first thing that crossed my mind was, it would really suck to have to cross this intersection while walking or cycling. Of course, there will be people who protest and complain. They won't want their neighborhood being cut in half by an AV highway. But we can't have these Luddites denying us our transportation utopia. As a compromise, we'll be promised pedestrian bridges to keep neighborhoods connected, though due to cost cutting, only a few of them will actually get built. When highways came to New York City, they completely destroyed some neighborhoods and separated others. A handful of pedestrian bridges like this one were built to reconnect neighborhoods. These bridges are awful. They require walking up long ramps, they feel like dirty concrete trenches, and they're really ugly. The chain link fence separates you from the high-speed traffic below, but the noise and pollution from cars is unbearable. These were clearly built to benefit drivers by keeping pedestrians out of the way and not for the benefit of people walking. In the AV city, you won't be able to cross the street. You'll need to go out of your way to the nearest pedestrian bridge, walk up the ramp, cross the bridge, and walk back down to where you want to go, all while enduring the deafening sound and toxic air of the high-speed traffic below. This will be the city of the future. Streets that are completely consumed by autonomous vehicles. Intersections that are impossible to cross. Cities that are carved up by self-driving expressways, creating islands that are infeasible to leave on foot. With air and noise pollution so bad, it makes travel outside unbearable. We'll have a transportation system that consists entirely of autonomous vehicles, so that you won't be able to do anything, go to work, go to school, even buy food for your family without paying an AV company to get you there. And once every other form of transportation is either eliminated or infeasible, the autonomous vehicle companies will ramp up prices. They'll be able to charge whatever they want because we'll have no alternatives. So what can we do about it? Well, this brings me to my fundamental issue with the entire concept of self-driving cars. I grew up in a car-dependent city called London, Ontario, Canada, and despite its Thames River, Oxford Street, and Covent Garden Market, it's nothing like real London, a kind of fake London, if you will. When I arrive in fake London by train, I'm on the side of a high-speed strode across from a surface parking lot. There isn't much left of downtown, and my only option to get anywhere is a taxi. The city is very spread out and designed almost exclusively for cars. Bus service is highly unreliable and slow, and there's no way I would feel safe enough to ride a bike here. I have to drive pretty much everywhere to do pretty much anything, which, I gotta say, kinda sucks. Too many people drive really dangerously, and there are regular news stories about people being killed in car crashes. So when I'm sitting on a giant strode stuck in traffic, the idea of having the car take care of all this boring, dangerous driving seems pretty great. But then I think about Utrecht. Utrecht is a city in the middle of the Netherlands, and I have to go there fairly regularly for one reason or another. The population of Utrecht is very similar to that of fake London, but otherwise, these cities are very, very different. So you're probably thinking that it's almost comical to compare Utrecht to London, right? I mean, it seems ridiculous because these cities have almost nothing in common. And yet 100 years ago, they were pretty similar. Sure, the architecture was different, but the fundamental design of the city was pretty comparable. Both were compact, walkable cities full of mixed-use neighborhoods and connected by streetcars because both cities were founded long before automobiles were invented. Over the 20th century, both cities embraced the automobile and both cities built wide roads and highways. Utrecht filled in a canal in their city center and turned it into a highway, and London bulldozed a neighborhood to build a wide road straight into downtown. Utrecht and London both even bulldozed part of their city center to build a suburban-style shopping mall, and these malls were both the first of their kind in their respective countries. Utrecht was about a decade behind London, but otherwise these cities were on exactly the same path. That is, until about the 1990s when Utrecht decided to change course, due to growing concerns about the negative impact of car-centric development. They made a fundamental decision to make the city friendlier to people walking and cycling, to reduce car traffic, and to create better public spaces. The highway around the city center was turned back into a canal. You'd never know that this used to be a highway. And today, that downtown shopping center is connected directly to a new train station via a pedestrianized area, and closely integrated with the rest of the city on the other side. It's such an incredible difference to arrive in this place by train compared to fake London. Despite having almost the same population as my hometown, it hosts the busiest train station in the Netherlands, transporting over 200,000 people per day, with over 1,000 daily departures on national and international trains. There are hundreds of destinations within walking distance of the station, and there are great connections to other forms of public transit, including this new tram system. Underneath the station is the world's largest bicycle parking garage, with spaces for over 12,000 bicycles. And I can pick up one of the hundreds of rental bicycles using my transit card and cycle to any destination. I can cycle anywhere I want quickly and easily, and because of the high-quality infrastructure, I never feel unsafe. It also helps that car volumes are low, and so are the speed limits. Near the train station is this street accessible only to walking, cycling, and public transit. This is one of the busiest cycling paths in the world, and I probably see more people cycling in 5 minutes here than I have in my entire life in fake London. Walking around the city is also convenient and comfortable. The streets are lined with interesting shops and restaurants, and there isn't a surface parking lot in sight anymore. There are many nice residential neighborhoods, and it's remarkably quiet too, because as I've realized over the years, cities aren't loud, cars are loud. I don't feel unsafe walking and cycling here, so the safety promises of autonomous vehicles don't really seem to matter much. There isn't a lot of traffic because there are viable alternatives to driving. People aren't forced to drive here, so the only people in cars are those who need to drive or those who really want to drive. Self-driving cars are supposed to provide mobility to children, the disabled, and the elderly, and yet I see all of those people getting around just fine in Utrecht, because universal access to mobility isn't a fundamental issue, it's a problem caused by car dependency. Would this guy be better off in a self-driving car? Maybe, I didn't ask him, but it's not like he's unable to get around independently here, like would be the case where I'm from. Now, Utrecht isn't perfect, and the city still shows the scars of that 1960s car-centric development, but it also just doesn't have most of the problems that autonomous vehicles are supposed to solve. And yet, they did it without any advanced technology, without spending hundreds of billions of dollars, and without letting their city be controlled by the whims of multi-billion-dollar corporations either. If everybody here was in self-driving cars, this place would be much, much worse. So it seems what we really need is not driverless cars, it's carless drivers. I think Utrecht and cities like it can provide a template for what we should be doing to prepare for self-driving cars. We need to limit where cars can go, and that includes autonomous vehicles. Utrecht has many places that are off limits to cars, but motor vehicles are still extremely useful sometimes, so access is still provided for delivery trucks, emergency vehicles, and people with disabilities. We need fewer cars in cities, so we should definitely tear down urban freeways that divide neighborhoods and turn the space into parks, shops, and houses. Cars should go around cities and not through them. We should make it impossible to drive through the middle of the city by car. The most direct route should only be accessible by walking, cycling, and public transit enforced by modal filters. We also need to lower speed limits now to make the streets safer today, but also to reduce noise and pollution. Lowering speed limits can sometimes be controversial, but after it's done, there is nearly universal support to keep them low, so Let's do it now before AVs take a foothold. We need to remove parking, especially surface parking lots. We're never going to be able to charge for parking once cars can drive themselves, so let's start removing parking spaces now and turn them into something more useful. And let's stop building any new parking garages too. After all, they tell us they won't even be necessary once we have autonomous vehicles, right? So let's not build them at all. Instead, let's build more mixed-use walkable neighborhoods so that the places where people live, work, and shop are closer together, making it easy to get where you're going without needing a car at all. And safe sidewalks and bike lanes should be part of the standard street design guidelines, so they're built automatically with every new construction. We need to invest in functional and viable public transit, especially infrastructure that is difficult to remove. History has shown us that bus routes will get overrun by cars, so we need more trams and trains and a lot more dedicated transit lanes. And we have to ensure that public transit remains under democratic control so that it can never be captured by private corporations. And most importantly of all, and I cannot stress this enough, we need to put a price on driving. We absolutely must keep AVs from circling around and clogging up our streets. The gas tax is going away as cars transition to electric anyway, so let's replace it with something better. Cars should be charged based on how much they drive, but also when they drive too, with a higher price during periods of peak congestion. If we do all of these things to fortify our cities, then we might just be ready for the onslaught of autonomous vehicles. Then we can allow AVs into the city on our terms to provide transportation where it's genuinely needed, not just where it profits tech companies the most. And if the naysayers are correct, that self-driving cars really are just a pipe dream and they never reach mass adoption, then I guess we'll do all that work and just be left with beautiful, functional, efficient, and sustainable cities accessible to all, and that might just be the best outcome. If you'd like to learn more about great cities or just want more urbanist content, there are lots of relevant videos here on Not Just Bikes, but I can also recommend several other channels such as City Beautiful, City Nerd, and RM Transit. Like the City Beautiful video, How to Remove a Highway, about the strategies that several cities have used to remove urban freeways. And the absolute best place to watch all of those channels is on our streaming service, Nebula. Nebula is the fastest growing independent streaming service on the internet. It's got thousands of unique, interesting, and thoughtful videos from hundreds of talented creators. Think of it like Netflix, but for people who love trains. On Nebula, you can watch all of my videos early before they're available on YouTube and without any ads or sponsorship messages. Nebula also produces exclusive content that's not available anywhere else, like the highly entertaining series The Getaway or Abigail Thorne's latest film, Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend. My favorite part about Nebula, though, is that it's owned and operated by creators, including me. So it's designed to benefit creators